Welcome to my home. It is where I feel safe. If someone came into my home and told me to burn all the furniture and then the house itself just to keep warm for one night, I would think they're crazy. The economic rules that define everything, how we eat, how we clothe ourselves, how we live, they're burning the house we live in and accelerating a planetary collapse. We have exceeded 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries. More than 1,000 cities and nations have declared a planetary emergency.
The government says more than half of the country is in state of emergency.
Currently a Category 5 hurricane with maximum winds of 100.
At the same time, half the world lives on less than $10 a day, while 8 billionaires own more wealth than 4 billion people combined. We are, for the very first time in humanity's history, facing the very real possibility of our own extinction. We are starting to recognize that GDP is not an adequate measure of human well-being, and it never was.
It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile.
And if we redefine GDP, we must also redefine prosperity and economic growth. When we redefine prosperity, we find solutions that work for people and the planet.
The Article 5 of the Constitution of Bhutan demands that every citizen is a role player and a custodian of our natural environment. No amount of money in this world could buy it back for us.
We are starting to decouple growth and prosperity from environmental damage. We are starting to put nature at the heart of sustainable development. We are starting to live within our planetary boundaries.
It seems like something that a lot of people are waiting for. This idea, there is an alternative, there's another way of we can rearrange our economics that is better for the people and is better for the planet. And don't wait for the perfect moment, because the perfect moment is now.
Cities such as Sydney, Melbourne, Berlin, Brussels, and Amsterdam are transforming their urban economies to live within the planetary boundaries while meeting the basic needs of all their residents.
A circular city is a city where we don't have waste. If something is broken, we want to have it repaired. If something can't be repaired, we want to have the materials that the products are made of can be reused.
The entire city is in the midst of a massive shift launched last year, embracing a radical new economic theory with a catchy name, donut economics.
A donut-shaped compass for creating the 21st century that we want.
What makes the theory radical is Rayworth's assertion that governments need to stop looking at GDP growth as the ultimate measure of success.
We're getting very, very clear signals from the Earth system, from climate breakdown, from ecological breakdown, that the way we are pursuing growth is destroying the living systems on which we depend.
The outer ring represents Earth's ecological ceiling, limits on damage being done to the planet, including climate change, air pollution, and shrinking freshwater supplies. The inner ring represents a social foundation, minimum living standards like having enough food, housing, work, and a political voice. The ring in between, described as humanity's sweet spot, is the donut.
So let's leave nobody in the hole in the middle of the donut. Everybody into this lovely green ring.
Solutions can also look like maps of hope, where countries can identify where they need to protect, restore, and manage nature to allow people and nature to thrive.
We have developed high-quality, reliable spatial data on nature for decision makers. These maps of critical biodiversity areas and ecological infrastructure are helping stakeholders to manage land, rivers, and catchments for sustainable development.
Our development and economic models are broken, but we are already creating and testing new ones. We already have nature-positive solutions. More than anything, we need a nature-positive model for development that works for everyone.
Welcome to the Nature for Life Hub. I'm Jameson Irvin, and I'll be your host for today's session on Nature for Development and Climate. This first segment focuses on our need to redefine the very nature of development. We'll hear how human development, the process by which we strive to improve social and economic well-being for all, has for too long ignored the environmental impacts of economic growth. We'll hear from the United Nations Development Program and from two governments on how we can redefine growth by putting nature at the very heart of sustainable development. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Nature for Life Hub. I'm Haoliang Xu, Director of the Bureau for Policy and Program Support in the United Nations Development Program. This year's Nature for Life Hub occurs between two of the most important meetings for the planet. The first, the COP27, the 27th Conference of Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the second, COP15, the 15th Conference of Parties of the Convention on Biodiversity. COP27 seeks to change our current course on climate change and keep to a 1.5-degree future. COP15 seeks to change the course of biodiversity loss and create a nature-positive world. Both climate change and the loss of nature pose existential threats to humanity. We have already lost nearly 70% of all biodiversity in just the last 50 years, and we're on track for a 3-degree future or higher if we don't take more drastic actions. Biodiversity and climate change are simply intrinsically linked. As we look to the Biodiversity Conference and the adoption of a global biodiversity framework, the equivalent of the Paris Agreement for nature, we must push for the transformational changes that we need to see if we are to avoid losing even more biodiversity in the coming decades. We must ensure in sustainable development by changing how we think about nature, climate, and development. We must create a planetary safety net for humanity by protecting and restoring the ecosystems that are essential for our lives. We must transform finance to fill the finance gap for nature and to redirect public expenditures and private investments that harm nature to be nature positive. And we must catalyze and support local action everywhere. The Nature for Life Hub, with such a wide diversity of solutions, shows us that change is possible and it is happening all around us. This year, as we head towards the Global Biodiversity Conference, I urge all of us, governments, businesses, communities, NGOs, to stand together and make the bold decisions we need for a nature-positive future. We must continue to not only make bold commitments, but also to take bold actions and to walk the talk on both issues. Enjoy the Nature for Life Hub and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Thank you.
Club of Rome is a group of scientists, humanists, educators,
It's irritating that humanity has not listened to us, but they haven't.
The warning bells were there already 50 years ago. The big difference is that now we truly are in the midst of the crises.
We are much, much closer to potentially catastrophic outcomes.
Now we have a short opportunity where everything is up in the air,
We thought it was the time to now reassess to see what does science tell us today and how does the future look like the next 50 years.
We have to change the story. We have to provide a plausible, coherent, consistent, and also science-based and numbers-backed story that people find more attractive than business as usual. We have one scenario called too little, too late, and then the other one is where we succeed in putting all those possibilities together.
We are proposing 5 turnarounds paid for by the 10% richest people in the world.
If we put in place the 5 turnarounds that we talk about, the focusing on inequality, the focus on poverty, the focus on empowerment, and then food and energy as the 2 key resources that will keep us alive as we're faced with some of these ongoing crises, then we actually could get ourselves out of this mess.
And the interesting thing with these 5 turnarounds is that they can be scaled from communities to cities to sectors, nations, regions, and then globally. That's what we were looking for, like a fractal set of fractals that escalate or percolate down from the global economic system all the way down to specific communities.
We need to start with redressing, making sure that the solution is fair, is perceived as fair by a democratic majority. Unless we do so, we won't get a solution.
It's critical we talk about poverty because the poorest in societies are the most vulnerable and face the biggest risks, as we can see with the flooding in Pakistan, and we can see with the food crisis in sub-Saharan Africa. It's absolutely critical that we use this as an opportunity to spur sustainable economic development.
Currently, a large part of the world is materially, financially, economically insecure. And it is true when they're working, whether they're paid or unpaid, and it is true when they are not working. So a universal pension that guarantees affordable life is an essential part of this. So many women across the world, their lives are dominated by the unpaid work they do. If you want healthy, sustainable, viable societies, the importance of recognizing the contribution of women and the rights of women is absolutely essential. It is really about ensuring that societies are sustainable, that social reproduction occurs, and it's about ensuring that the rights of half the world's population are met adequately. Women must be given the freedom to make their own life choices.
In the food system, we would see a rapid change towards more logistics that reduce the unnecessary food waste and food loss so that we have food security.
I'm absolutely convinced that the Ukraine war will help us to accelerate the transition away from oil, coal, and natural gas.
So we could see an energy democracy where local sources, microgrids, local areas don't have to rely so much on the global fossil energy system.
What we're facing is not an environmental crisis. It's a crisis of security, of stability, of prosperity and equity. And that's what Earth for All really brings forward.
So the overall object of the latest report is basically to continue the fight.
If sufficient mobilization occurs, and if the demand for major changes in economic strategy gets loud enough, then we can actually achieve a major turnaround.
I'm fairly optimistic that we are going to see a very, very rapid transformation. But the question is, will it be fast enough?
Now we need to come together and we need to share this image that a giant leap is fully possible.
That comes back to a series of different structural shifts that we will have to make across the globe in order to ensure that we have truly an Earth for all.
We are all dependent on the natural world. Every breath of air we take, every mouthful of food we eat, depends upon a healthy natural world. We have no alternative but to try and work in harmony with the natural world. If we ignore its requirements, if we tread roughshod over it, if we simply destroy it when it gets in our way, we will pay the price. Some might say we are already paying the price. Now is the time to make amends, and now is the time to listen to our conscience.
We live at a time when in the last decade we've seen a global financial crisis, we've seen the rise of inequality, we've seen the climate crisis, and now we have this awful pandemic. Since the first report in 1990, when it pioneered the Human Development Index, this report has sought to shift the focus of development economics from the narrow lens of cold statistics on economic growth to the broader sweep of policies with people at its center. The Human Development Report has long cautioned against the slavish adherence to the GDP per capita criterion as a reliable measure of development. This latest report, my friends, which we launched today, continues in that fine, thought-provoking tradition. The choice of theme, human development and the Anthropocene, could hardly have been more apt or more relevant. None of us can deny that 2020 has been a cataclysmic year of extraordinary devastation. Unprecedented floods, drought, wildfires, hurricanes, and record-breaking temperatures, and now indeed this pandemic of biblical proportions. We cannot find in living memory a more stark illustration of the impact of human activity on the Earth's ecosystems, a more vivid red flag on the dangerous and growing imbalance between people and planet. The level of scientific knowledge freely communicated throughout our interconnected societies shows us without equivocation that human activity is endangering our planet and threatening the quality of life and eventual survival of future generations. I am convinced, my friends, that we can find the will and the capacity to implement policies that strike a sustainable balance between humanity and the planet, a balance that aims to redress social and economic inequalities between and within states, incentivizes behavioral change towards positive environmental stewardship, seeks to fight the next slow-motion pandemic of antimicrobial resistance from now rather than waiting to when it becomes the largest killer of human beings in 2050, finances green transitions and inculcates values of caring and community within our societies. There is one thing I am absolutely certain of, which gives me hope and confidence every day. Either my generation is now prepared to lead as responsible adults, or young children like the ones I've been showing off recently in my own country will become the committed brigade of young activists waiting in the wings, and they will step up and do it for us. It is up to us whether we truly make what is potentially the worst of times the best of times by choosing the right thing to do and by choosing to live differently. I thank you.
It was under the service of His Majesty the Great Fourth King and under his political will and guidance that we were able to do many things which has taken us on this wonderful journey till today, where Bhutan is one of the leaders in this world in environmental conservation. To begin with, in the early 70s, we stopped all our forestry activities. No more destroying our forests. His Majesty said we must take stock of our forests. We must not destroy our nature, and we must look after our country so that in the future our children will be able to enjoy the beauty of this country. The Bhutan Trust Fund was set up in the early 90s with the help of many development partners. It was the first trust fund of its kind in the world. This has also helped to finance many of our conservation projects and support them. Cross-national happiness. This wonderful saying which His Majesty the Fourth King said when he was a young man. He propagated that he was going to bring wealth and development to this country and change. But with this newfound wealth and change, we must not lose sight of our natural values, our value systems, our respect for our teachers, for our elders, for our parents, for our religion and culture. For if we were to lose that, no amount of money in this world could buy it back for us. These are all principles which guided us on our environmental journey. Nature in Bhutan is not the responsibility of any one agency or any one person. The Article 5 of the Constitution of Bhutan demands that every citizen is a role player and a custodian of our natural environment. And it is this which we are trying to propagate. Various civil society organizations have cropped up. The Royal Society for Protection of Nature, the Ecological Society, the BirdLife Society of Bhutan, doing wonderful work. Today, climate change plays a very important role in Bhutan. We have to adapt to changing ways. The glacial lakes are melting faster than ever and posing great threat downstream. We have unusual weather patterns affecting farmers and crops. Wildlife depredation on livestock at an unprecedented rate than we've ever had before. This human-wildlife conflict is another one we're having a difficult time in coming to terms with, in balancing it. So innovative mechanisms now have to be developed so that the farmers and the livestock owners do not suffer great economic disasters so that they go out of business. I hope that the international community will come out and help Bhutan so that we can continue this wonderful environmental journey and conservation to be an example to the world and keep our nature pure and unadulterated. For this, we need your help.
We know that we need to change the rules for development. We need to start thinking about how we measure progress and how we measure wealth. We also need to learn how to live within our planetary boundaries. At the same time, we need to raise the standard of living for the nearly 4 billion people who live on less than $10 a day. Let's hear a review of some of the latest thinking on how we need to change the rules for development.
How do you measure the wealth of a country? For many, gross domestic product is the first and perhaps only measurement that comes to mind. GDP measures the monetary value of the goods and services a country produces, but it doesn't provide information on a country's wealth or how sustainable development will be in the long term. To do that, we need to consider all of a country's assets, the ones used to produce those goods and services in the first place. So what assets ought to be considered? Let's explore some of them. First, the natural capital, like forests, agricultural lands, fisheries, and minerals. Also the human-made or produced capital, buildings, roads, machinery, and such. And of course, the skills and experience of the population, a country's human capital. Taking stock of a country's assets can help determine whether or not growth is sustainable. Exploiting natural resources may look like economic growth today, but what about the future? Forest degradation, air pollution, overfishing, and more deplete wealth and threaten future prosperity. Overdependence on certain non-renewable resources, especially fossil fuels, also poses risks. Steps to increase future prosperity are possible, however. Protecting and investing in renewable natural capital is imperative, particularly in the face of climate change. For example, consider how storms are increasing in frequency and intensity, all while coastlines are further developed. What can be done to protect these coastal assets? One innovative approach: replant mangroves, a renewable natural resource. Mangroves are becoming even more valuable because of the protection they offer coastlines. Investments in replanting and protecting mangroves, especially where they are protecting other assets, can safeguard future wealth. Natural and produced capital aren't the only types of resources in need of protection, though. Did you know that in most countries, human capital represents the greatest fraction of wealth? The global COVID-19 pandemic shows just how at risk human capital and livelihoods can be, and reinforced the need to address ongoing issues like gender gaps and the health impacts of air pollution. The World Bank's Changing Wealth of Nations 2021 provides the most comprehensive data to date, with full accounts of wealth for 146 countries. Through wealth accounting, decision makers can promote future economic viability and growth with policies that promote sustainable use and diversification of assets. Look ahead to the future with an eye on climate change and other risks, and continually invest in a nation's greatest resource, its people.
Hi, I'm John. I work for a company, a big company, a company that still doesn't realize it relies on nature, which is why I'm organizing a big meeting, to discuss natural capital. It's a new idea to boost our business. You've heard of financial capital, right? So what is natural capital? Well, let's take company A, that's us. We make shoes, lots of shoes. So let's take a shoe. This one's a leather. Leather comes from cows. To make a cow, you need grass and grain. That's a lot of land and a lot of water. To make a shoe, you gotta have a sole. Do you think soles come from thin air? Get a grip. We need rubber, and lots of it. This rubber comes from rubber trees. Trees need land, soil, and water. We need aluminium for eyelets, another natural resource. Let's keep moving. We need energy, water, chemicals, dyes. Our shops need building, cooling, lighting, heating. And when our shoes wear out, imagine this. Severe floods hit somewhere important in our supply chain. Livelihoods are lost. Our factories fail. Hashtag corporate nightmare. But does it have to be that way? What if we replant forests to protect our sites from floods? Or restore wetlands to filter water? Or turn old shoes into something new? What if we realised that investing in natural infrastructure could save us cash too? So back to my question, what is natural capital? It's all the value that nature provides for us, the natural assets we have. If our company had to pay for our impact on nature, we'd owe $6 a pair. That's real money. So ask yourself, what does nature provide for your business? And shouldn't it be on your balance sheet?
How can we halt biodiversity loss and protect our natural environment? Accounting. Yes, accounting. When we think of accountants, we don't often think tree hugger. But maybe we should. Accountants could be the new activists. Accounting is the practice of recording financial transactions and reporting the results. Every day, decisions are made on the back of clear and accurate accounts. So accounting can be a powerful tool. Every country maintains national accounts. This is how we get measures like national expenditure and GDP. But these accounts don't reflect trends in environmental quality or degradation. How can we account for nature? Our coasts, wetlands and forests can also be thought of as assets that need to be maintained and managed. Just like in business, if you don't invest in your assets, they will depreciate over time. This is where natural capital accounting comes in. Natural capital accounting is a systematic way to measure and report on stocks and flows of natural capital. Organising this information can help decision makers understand how the environment interacts with the economy. So, if we have an ecosystem like a wetland, we can account for things like the stock and quality of the water there and the richness of the species present. This gives us a clear description of the asset, or natural capital. But why do we care about this? For this part of the story, we need to consider the flows from the asset, called ecosystem services. The wetland provides a whole range of ecosystem services, like water purification, sediment retention, habitat for species, and cultural enjoyment. Natural capital accounting brings different sets of accounts together under one framework. The accounts consider the extent or size of the asset and how it changes over time. The condition, for example, is the wetland drained or functioning well? The services that the asset provides. Is the wetland storing and filtering water by natural processes? And of course, benefits for humans and wildlife, like high water quality. Natural capital accounting can be carried out at different scales: a wetland, a river catchment, a county, and a national scale. These accounts can help us make decisions about how we can work with our environment, our society, and our economy. But the final piece of the puzzle is linking natural capital accounts to our national accounts. The UN has developed a standard for doing just this. The standard is called the SIA, or System of Environmental Economic Accounting. SIA brings together environmental and economic information to produce internationally comparable statistics. Over 80 countries around the world are already implementing the SIA. And in 2020, the SIA will be included as an indicator for measuring the Sustainable Development Goals. Simply put, we don't currently account for nature in our decision-making. Natural capital accounting helps us to do that and make more informed decisions across a range of sectors, including health, farming, tourism, and planning. Follow the In-Case project to see how Ireland can begin this journey and start making nature a part of our future. See ya!
Our economies, livelihoods, and our well-being all depend on our most precious asset, nature. We are embedded in nature. We're part of nature, intrinsically tied into it. Nature provides us with our food, shelter. It regulates the climate, cleanses the water we drink. It fixes nitrogen, offers us pollination. In fact, it's impossible to think of anything we do which isn't built around what nature provides. Estimates of our total demand of nature suggest that we would need roughly 1.6 Earths to satisfy our current demand, and we haven't got an additional 0.6 Earths. Humanity now faces an urgent choice. The demands we make on nature vastly exceeds nature's ability to supply them on a sustainable basis. If we continue this path, then nature will be further degraded and our civilizations will suffer. In conventional thinking, when we talk about economic progress, the one item that is missing is nature. While humanity has prospered immensely in recent decades, we have done so at the expense of nature. We have accumulated produced capital and human capital to an unprecedented extent, but we have simultaneously degraded nature in an unprecedented way. We have to think of ourselves as asset managers. Individuals, businesses, governments, international organizations, they're all asset managers. Collectively, however, we have failed to manage the global portfolio of our assets sustainably. Biodiversity provides nature, or ecosystems, if you like, the components of nature, with resilience, health. A bit like diversity of assets in a portfolio of assets provides the portfolio with stability. So if you reduce biodiversity, we suffer because nature becomes less resilient. We need to keep 3 transformative changes in mind that are now needed. First, we need to close the gap between the demands we make on nature and nature's ability to supply. And at the same time, increase nature's ability to supply them. Second transition, we need to change the way we think, act, and measure economic success. Move away from GDP, or gross domestic product, which does not recognize the depreciation or degradation of nature, to a measure which is like a balance sheet, the wealth or the assets that we hand over to our descendants. That should be the key with which we judge whether we are doing things well. And thirdly, we need to transform our institutions, such as our financial institutions and our education system, in such a way as to align the incentives we face with those actions that further the common good. The problems we face today are no different from those that our ancestors faced. The difference really is in quantity. Our distant ancestors were small in number. They did not have an impact on the biosphere as a whole. We do, and we are inflicting enormous damage to the biosphere today. There are success stories from all over the world of what is possible, but we need to enlarge these successes into one grand success, and that still eludes us. The same ingenuity that has made such a seeming success of our lives at the cost of nature perhaps can now be redirected in such a way that our lives are enhanced even while nature is enhanced. At its core, the problem is to find a balance between what we take from nature and what we leave behind for our descendants. Perhaps we can even do this in a short time. We and our descendants deserve nothing less.
Our planet is changing before us, propelled by our collective patterns of consumption, production, non-stop mobility, and a growing population. We're losing our natural world. 75% of the world's food comes from just 12 plant and 5 animal species. The Earth's temperature is rising. 20 of the warmest years on record have occurred since 1998. Deforestation is costing us. 40% of the world's major watersheds have less than half of their original tree cover left. The ocean is warming and becoming more acidic. Oceans have already absorbed 30% of anthropogenic carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Can we shift our collective patterns? Will we learn to live within our planet's natural limits? The 9 planetary boundaries underpin life on Earth. They signify the Earth's capacity to tolerate more change and tell us how close we are to pushing the natural limits. Biosphere integrity. How can ecosystems survive if they're engulfed by urban development and continued resource extraction? Climate change. Can we prevent temperatures rising when cities are responsible for over 70% of global carbon dioxide emissions? Novel entities. How many more toxic and harmful pollutants can we release until our health and ecosystems are damaged beyond repair? Stratospheric ozone depletion. How can we carry on rehabilitating the ozone? Atmospheric aerosol loading. How much more dust, soot, smoke and fumes can the air above us take? Ocean acidification. Can we absorb more carbon dioxide into our urban areas rather than the ocean? Biogeochemical flows. How much more fertilizer can we use before we run out, or our waterways and coastal zones can no longer support life? Freshwater use. How much more water can we divert for food and human settlements? Land system change. How many more forests can we lose to urban sprawl and resource extraction? The planetary boundaries give us a framework to rethink how we design natural and built environments differently, to work with nature rather than against it, and to restore planetary health. Can we design, build, and create the world around us differently? Can we restore the damage done to date? Will we regenerate Earth's finite resources? To support a healthier planet, we've set out 20 actions to improve outcomes, to influence, design and deliver in our cities, our towns and our rural communities, from sustainable materials to native landscaping, from green roofs to urban growth boundaries. At national, city, street and building scale, we can collectively drive change towards more regenerative built and natural environments, so we can all think bigger, broader and more holistically. Bigger than carbon, beyond our borders, greater than any of us, to understand the limits of our planet and design to stay within them. 9 planetary boundaries, 20 actions. For designing, for planning, for building, to make business decisions, to drive our personal choices, to restore nature, for a planet that thrives for generations to come.
In the 20th century, economics lost its purpose and started chasing the false goal of GDP growth. In recent decades, that has pushed many societies into deepening inequality, and it's pushing us all towards ecological collapse. This century calls for a new goal, meeting the needs of all within the means of the planet. In other words, it's time to get into the donut, the sweet spot for humanity. But that's no easy task. Today, billions of people still fall short of their daily needs, from food, housing and energy to healthcare and education. And yet collectively, we've already overshot our pressure on some of Earth's most critical life support systems, driving climate change and the breakdown of biodiversity. What we do to this Earth in the next 50 years will shape the next 10,000. So let's replace that last century goal of endless growth with the goal of thriving in balance. And if we're to have half a chance of getting there, what economic mindset would be fit for the task?
Climate change, hunger, inequality. We know the challenges. We understand how we must respond. So what is standing in our way? Our Human Development Report says that it is because lives are being unsettled and times are uncertain in ways that have no precedent.
Lives are unsettled in many ways. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, more than 6 in 7 people worldwide felt insecure. And stress is rising too, as you can see. Before 2020, reversals in the Human Development Index were rather uncommon, about 1 out of 10 countries, including during the period of global financial crisis. But in 2020 and 2021, it rose to 9 out of 10 countries. Global development has been turned on its head. And that is why the Global Human Development Index has declined for the first time and 2 years in a row. It is back to its 2016 level. Unsettled lives, unsettled minds. As shown in this graph, we are facing a crisis in mental health. In total, 1 in 8 now suffer from mental health disorders, 10 percentage points higher than a decade ago. This is a challenge for those affected and is a major roadblock to advancing human development. Why are lives being unsettled?
The reason, we believe, is that uncertainty is changing. Yes, we've always lived with uncertainty. There's nothing new about disease, war, or poverty. But today, there are 3 new and interacting layers of uncertainty. First, we confront a new planetary reality with climate change, biodiversity loss, and new diseases like COVID-19. They are all driven and amplified by inequalities. Second, we are pursuing a massive transformation towards a low-carbon future, all while technological innovation is also racing ahead. And third, there is widespread and intensifying polarization across and within countries. Together, they form what we call a new uncertainty complex, and it is unsettling lives everywhere.
As a result, people feel more insecure. More insecure people tend to trust others less, and as the slide shows, they are more likely to hold extreme political views. With insecurity increasing, fewer than 30% trust others, its lowest recorded value, and we see rising political polarization. At the limit, this can turn into violent conflict, which is already affecting more than 1.2 billion people. Democratic practices like freedom of expression are under stress. And this is making it harder to come together to tackle shared problems at a time when we need to most.
So what to do? Uncertainty can also broaden our horizons about what we can achieve. It can make what was once unfeasible now possible. The response to COVID-19, despite the many challenges and glaring inequalities, has provided some examples. There were new vaccines, bold policies for social protection, and we all adopted new social norms and behaviors. To harness these new possibilities, we must embrace uncertainty. But to do this, people need to feel safe and in control of their own lives. How do we achieve this? Both policies and social norms need to change. We can start in 2 ways. On the one hand, policies to ramp up investment in people, insurance to protect from the ups and downs, and innovation to respond to whatever challenges humanity might face. On the other, by shifting social norms through education to strengthen agency, through social recognition and representation to acknowledge everyone's right to be heard. Social movements can help lead the way.
Ultimately, to navigate uncertainty, we need to double down on human development. Doubling down on human development means improving health and education, but also giving people a greater sense of control over their lives. By addressing inequality and enhancing people's freedoms and opportunities, we can unlock human potential, enabling choices so people can thrive today and tomorrow. Thank you.
Changing how we think about human development and changing our relationship with the planet requires more than just new tools to measure progress or measure national wealth. It requires a new narrative about nature and the role that nature plays in all of our lives. It requires us to rethink how we value nature for today's challenges and tomorrow's. And it requires a systems change approach where we look for levers and tipping points to change social rules, norms, and behaviors. In this next segment, we'll hear from leading thinkers on how we can accelerate a systems change approach in both theory and practice.
Welcome to the Nature for Life Hub and to this session, which is on the role of system change as we address nature-based solutions. Thanks so much to the System Change Lab who organized this session and to UNDP who is running the entire Nature for Life Hub program, which is so brilliant. So what exactly is system change? Well, there are complicated ways of explaining it and there are simple ways of explaining it. The complicated ways involve a lot of mathematics that comes out of the field of biology and ecology. But let me tell you the simple way of explaining it. The simple way is simply that as we look at these big problems we're trying to solve in nature or in industrial decarbonization or almost anything, we need to look at the big picture. There are rarely silver bullets. There are rarely single entry points that will solve the problem. There's a lot of interrelationship among different elements, and there are a lot of players that need to get involved. It sounds very complicated, but actually it's fairly intuitive. But one implication of this is that we need to work together as a team much better. No individual organization, no government, no private corporation, no NGO, no scientist on their own can solve this. We need to work together. Let me give you an example. So for example, if we care about tropical deforestation in Southeast Asia, we have to care about palm oil. Palm oil is responsible for 3/4 of the deforestation. So a sort of simple approach would be to say, well, clearly the government of Indonesia or Malaysia needs to pass a law which says no more destroying a virgin forest in order to plant palm oil. But actually that doesn't work. That's been tried. It's very difficult for almost any government to make that work. What we really need to do is think about the entire system, which includes those that are planting, smallholders, estates, but also those that are purchasing, those that are in Singapore purchasing. They need to know how can they distinguish between honorably harvested palm oil and dishonorably. Well, that needs a scientific approach. That requires satellite technology. That requires that you are able to say of the 1,000 palm oil mills in Southeast Asia, the following 300 actually are dishonorable. So you need that kind of information. But then, of course, you need those that are using the palm oil. You need the manufacturers. You need the retailers. And actually, you need those of us that use palm oil. Most people use palm oil 4 or 5 times a day. You brush your teeth, you put on makeup, you eat margarine, all of which have palm oil in. We need to know the story and we need to have the different players in place. And the great thing is that whilst this sounds complicated, once you start thinking about it clearly, it can work. And that's precisely why deforestation in Indonesia has now shrunk so much. Not solved, but it's shrunk because there is now a system-wide approach. Now, there's another important theme in system change, and that is the idea of a tipping point. We've all know of tipping points that happen fairly quickly. We know that literally in 10 years, the views on same-sex marriage changed. They flipped, if you like. That same idea of tipping point happens actually in systems, believe it or not. They can move much more quickly than you think as people change their behavior, as new technologies come in, as price points are crossed, and you can get a sort of a tipping point, a flip that's unexpected. And I encourage you all to look at the website of the System Change Lab, and in particular to read the report they've just brought out, which is really important. They look at 40 major transitions that need to take place this decade and the next decade. And they ask the question, how goes the battle? How are they doing? And which of those are approaching tipping points? And what is the special sauce that will actually help get you across those tipping points? So there's a lot of learning that's going on. And you can look at any of the issues we're dealing with and apply the same approach. Consider the second most polluting species on the planet. It's cattle. We're the most polluting. They're the second, and they're polluting mainly because of us, of course. And what's the problem? The problem is huge methane emissions. The problem is the fact that as we eat more beef and we drink more milk, we have to expand the land, and the deforestation takes place. Agriculture is responsible for 1/3 of all greenhouse gases, and livestock alone is responsible for about 15%. So this is a big issue. What to do about solving it? Well, for example, you can reduce methane emissions by all kinds of food additives. There's a technological side of this. There's a behavioral side of this. There's a policy side. You need to bring carbon markets in to finance it. But in addition to that, there's a solution with regard to cattle needing less land. The average cattle in much of Latin America has more than a hectare each. Actually, you could have 4 or 5 cattle on a hectare, but you would need to change policies. You'd need to have clearer land use tenure arrangements. And above all, you would need to use modern approaches to pasture enrichment and even some modern techniques such as radio collars on cattle. So again, you start thinking about the entire system. And then, of course, what you really want over time is to shift towards more plant-based diets. If one eats beef, one uses 20 times as much land, 20 times as much water, and emits 20 times as much greenhouse gases as if one eats the same amount of nutrition on plant-based sources. And so over time, one wants to also think about how do we change behavior and how do we change tastes? And that, again, is part of the overall system. So the great news is that increasingly the community of policymakers, corporate leaders, NGOs, scientists are starting to think the same way about system change. We need to diagnose each of these systems, and we need to think about where do we inject what kind of action at what time to bring the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. Such an exciting time, such intellectual ferment going on right now. And the great thing is we're starting to see that now come down into real policies, real actions, and real investments. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. My name's Ed Davey. I'm co-director of WRI in the UK, and it's my great honour and privilege to interview 3 great leaders in systems change in this webinar on systems change theory, practice. I'm going to ask Rachel to start by introducing herself, and then I'm going to ask Scarlett and Dario to do the same. Rachel.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Rachel Dattell. I'm a co-director of our Systems Change Lab and sit within the World Resources Institute. I'm lovely to be here today.
Thank you, Rachel. Great to see you. Scarlett.
Hi, everybody. Lovely to be here today. My name is Scarlett Benson. I'm actually seconded from a systems change advisory firm called Systemic over to the World Resources Institute, where I'm working on 2 very exciting things. So I'm the Director of Corporate Standards for the Food and Land Use Coalition. And I'm also leading up the work within the Science Based Targets Initiative on beyond value chain mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you, Scarlett. Great to have you over with us from Systemic, and excellent to hear Systemic, as you would expect, knows a thing or two about systems change. Dario.
Hi, my name is Dario Soto. I am the chair of the Global Commons Alliance, and I'm also the executive secretary of the Global Water Partnership. And it's such a pleasure to be here sharing the panel with all of you.
Thank you so much, Dario. I'm going to start by asking Rachel, what are the major shifts needed to protect and restore nature? I might ask all of you that actually, but Rachel first.
Yeah, so as you all know, we are at a crossroads. The science is really clear. We absolutely need to halt biodiversity loss, do everything we can to mitigate and limit global warming to our 1.5 threshold. And so the major shifts that we need within the nature space are everything from between land and food, freshwater and oceans, everything from protecting, restoring, and sustainably managing these ecosystems, ensuring that we have productivity that still is sustainable for the incredible growing populations that we'll see over the coming decades. So quite a huge range of shifts when we're looking at everything that needs to occur to make sure that we're on track for a nature positive future.
Thank you, Rachel. And what about you, Scarlett? What's it look like to you to have a shift?
Yes, well, I mean, as Rachel says, there's so many different transformations that are needed. And in the Food and Land Use Coalition, we talk about these 10 critical transitions, all the way from shifting towards healthier diets to more stronger, strengthened rural livelihoods. But really the crux of all of it, I think, sits with what do we use land for? Land is a finite resource. And within the Food and Land Use Coalition, we were looking at, is it even possible for us to deliver climate, biodiversity, kind of poverty and health outcomes that we want to see? So a healthy population, a food secure population, just keeping within 1.5 degrees, bending the curve on nature. Is that even possible, or are we dealing with these trade-offs that are too that are really not able to be resolved? And the answer was that yes, it is possible, but it requires massive transformation. We're talking about taking 1.2 billion hectares of land and restoring that by 2050. That's more than the size of Europe. And the only way that we can do that whilst feeding the population and maintaining healthy population is for us to pull every single lever at the same time and very fast. So that's making sure that food systems are much more efficient in a sense. We waste 1/3 of food, but also making sure that there's diversity and some redundancy in that system so that it's also resilient to shocks. It means changing our diets. And in some countries in the world where we have a very, an overconsumption of meat, it means quite a significant reduction, not no meat consumption, but significant reductions in some places of the world. And it also means, moving, as Rachel said, to agricultural systems that are both productive but also regenerative, because we need to manage these two issues in agricultural systems. One, that they are kind of heavily polluting and that they're damaging biodiversity, and the other that they need to be productive so that we're not putting more pressure onto forests. So only through a combination of all of these levers at a very fast pace are we able to see that sort of huge change in how we use land. So it's for sure quite a daunting task, but I'm looking forward to some of the other questions in this conversation to see how we can prioritize our actions and make this huge complex change feel like something that is a bit more manageable.
Thank you, Scarlett. And Daria, what does systems change mean to you? And how do we translate this wonderful idea from theory to practice?
Well, to me, it means different things. First, it means transformation at all levels. It has to be a decisive path to transformation. It has to be transformation in the economic systems, energy, transportation. Scarlett mentioned agriculture, environment, the way we grow our food, but also the way we move it throughout our supply chain. So levels. It has to be a decisive path to transformation. It has to be transformation in the economic systems, energy, transportation. Scarlett mentioned agriculture, environment, the way we grow our food, but also the way we move it throughout our supply chain. So those are some elements have to be transformational all across. It has to be also scaled together, no? It has to be done in a joint manner, this transformation, and that's why the systemic approach component of that is not just one sector or one actor, but it's actually all the actors working together, collaborating, and it's also the end, I would say, or the reduction of this silo approach in which the different sectors and even people or entities within the same sector currently operate. Everybody's doing their own activities, their own things, even with the best intentions. But it's that siloed approach, even again with the best intentions, that is not letting us to take this transformational approach, whatever. So that to me is what means to be a systemic shift and systemic change.
Thank you so much, Sergio. Rachel, could you give me an example, us an example of how one small practice could amount to greater change over time? It'd be great to hear you think one example through.
Yeah, and actually, if you don't mind, and I'm just going to build on what Dario said, because I think it was a really good point, Dario. I mean, the sweeping changes that we need across so many of the ways that we talk about these important topics. So, for example, the nature agenda is such an important one, but is so interconnected with climate, and as is with all the other aspects that we look at for equity, or all these pieces systems are so interconnected. And the idea being that really with this systems lens, we need to be looking at the entirety, at the whole, and those patterns of change, understanding those key interconnections, and engaging different perspectives, right, from across all of these different systems, and constantly learning and adapting, probing our assumptions. So there's a whole complex, beautiful mess that we need to look at all at once. And Scarlett, to exactly what you were saying, and then Ed, to your question here, how do we break that down into step by step, making sure that we have really clear path forward. And just to give a quick insight to that from my angle is from Systems Change Lab's angle, we're really trying to find, break that down into what are the shifts, what are the actual indicators and kind of pieces of the much larger pie. To give you a sense of that scale of the much larger pie, we're looking at things like let's see, I think it's 14 different systems, 70 different shifts. Then within each of those, looking at 300 different indicators of how we might track progress. So just to give you a sense of the breadth and depth and scale when we say systems change across all these interconnected systems. And then maybe Scarlett, I can double click on what you were saying before around within the food system, how might some of these really specific examples add up to and be connected with these other systems.
Thank you, Rachel. Scarlett, you've mentioned some of these already, but could you talk about some of the most promising enabling conditions of change which would enable protection and restoration of nature at scale?
Yes, thanks, Ed. Well, yeah, also maybe to build on what is system change. I mean, I personally sometimes get extremely overwhelmed with what we're, the challenge that we face, and when people talk about system change and the complexity and 300 different indicators. And within the Food and Land Use Coalition, we did some really interesting work last year with the University of Exeter, where we tried to create this really intuitive framework for thinking about how to tip a system towards a positive state. So it's not just about systems change, it's also about looking for those places where an intervention might have a very outsized impact in the system, and so that you can create kind of more accelerated and rapid change. And we've really framed it around these kind of enabling conditions, and this is something that I can explain to my grandparents, and they do understand. It is quite intuitive. So you have things like price. So if an alternative, like alternative protein or an alternative, more regenerative form of agriculture will give sort of better economic benefit to either the consumer or the producer, that is a key barrier that we need to address. Once prices kind of, something as cost parity, then people will choose it. If it performs as well, thinking about electric vehicles, I can certainly tell you that my brother was moaning the other day about how electric cars aren't quite as fast yet. performance is clearly a very important one. The other one is accessibility. So you have supermarkets, it matters where they are presenting certain types of food. Give me a minute.
Yes, of course.
Sorry.
Dario, the most promising enabling conditions on your side for protecting and restoring nature?
Well, for me, one again is the policy environment. I mean, there has to be a good regulatory and policy environment to create these enabling conditions. They're not going to happen in the vacuum, and the power of the policies to shape behaviors is quite important. So that's one. The other one to me is financing. Many of the solutions that are dealing with energy, transitional energies, or renewable agriculture require quite, and also adaptation, mitigation, etc. to climate. They require quite a vast investment. It's not a traditional investment, but it's more an investment that is what we call now green investment, or which is more focused towards this pushing for this transformational change. So again, policy, regulatory framework, investments. I think there's also a need to invest in education, and I think is what we're doing in the Global Commons Alliance. We have the science. We're making the science broadly available to everybody, and that's the part where we can also create awareness among people. I think there's right now part of this siloed approach that we're going through is a lot of information out there, a lot of data points, and people don't know which one are real, which one are important, which one are not. So that investment in education, in making the science available, something that we do with GCA, is quite relevant as well. So I would say these drivers, and I would say the last one is involving corporate. We have to reach out across the aisle. We have to involve businesses. We have to involve cities, governments. So that part of this involvement, this reaching out, is super, super important as part of this equation.
Thank you, dear Dario. And Scarlett, could you talk to us about some of the biggest barriers to systems change for protecting and restoring nature, and how we could overcome them?
Absolutely, yeah. I think with nature you have these sort of market failures, and you also have governance failures. And the market failure is the obvious one. Lots of people talk about, which is the fact that we don't value nature. People gain economically to cut a tree down more than they do to keep it standing. We don't have markets that are truly internalizing those externalities. So, I mean, that is really the clearest thing. We need to shift our society so that we start to value the ecosystem services of nature. We have, carbon markets are really kind of, they're growing significantly year on year, but they're still relatively small. And other nature markets really are still quite nascent. There are kind of handfuls of examples where governments are paying for ecosystem services. In the UK government, they've been looking at subsidy reform to support farmers in delivering biodiversity outcomes. It's happening in other countries, but this is nascent. This is not systemic. So I think that's the key one. I mean, you also have clear governance failures, of course, sort of where there is policy in place, there's weak enforcement of it. You have corruption in certain countries. We have commitments from countries in the global north that have already destroyed much of their nature, commitments to support the global south financially, which haven't necessarily been, those commitments haven't been met. So there's a range of barriers which are not insubstantial at all, and so it really is going to take something quite sort of profound shift in how people view the world and how they engage with nature. I mean, maybe just to end on a positive point, is that I actually think food is the way that we can do that. We make choices about what we eat 3 times a day, unfortunately for me, sometimes even more. We're not locked into certain technologies as consumers that we have with other types of system change. And food is something we all connect to and feel, a sort of cultural identity related to our food. So I think food is the lens through which we can change things, but for sure it's not going to be super straightforward.
Thank you, Scarlett. Dario, in order to achieve widespread systems change, do our beliefs about the inherent rights of our natural resources and being need to change? And if so, how so?
Well, yes, I think they have to change. Some examples that I have. Well, first is we have this belief that resources are unlimited and not finite. No, and I know we have the difference between finite resources or not, but the perception is water is everywhere. So why there's a problem with water? Same with the forest. There's the Amazon. So there's this perception that nothing is going to happen. The other one is the perception of, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen in the future. I'm not going to be around, and there's always going to be time, and there's always going to be a technology. But that perception of keep putting it back for later, procrastinating, I think globally needs to also change. I think also the other element that could or needs to change is the perception that this is a problem of the governments. So governments need to tackle this, or companies need to tackle this. I think this is a global issue, and that's why the Global Commons Alliance we're facing it from citizens to cities, companies, governments. It's very holistic in that approach. And finally, I think the other one is perception, maybe by some, that climate and all matters related to the five commons are not matters in which humans can have much of influence. No, it's something that is there, it's natural. It's going to solve by itself, and if it's not, we cannot do anything. But that perception is wrong. We need to change that into that we can actually have collective and decisive action and turn the page and turn the course and maybe still reach the 1.5 goal that we have set for all of us, for humanity.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dario. How inspiring. Rachel, do you want to tackle that same question?
Yeah, I'll just build on what Dario was saying there. I mean, I think to your point, one of the aspects we look at within Systems Change Lab is good governance. So not only do we need the transformations in the systems you might expect, power, industry, transport, food, and so on, but also these kind of really important social systems. So good governance being one of those that we're trying to articulate and thinking through, how do we safeguard environmental human rights? How do we ensure that we're looking at recognizing indigenous and customary land rights, protecting environmental defenders, ensuring free and fair elections? What does that look like? How do we track progress against these things? And where might we shine a light on where we're missing data and where it's really hard to understand the landscape? A few other examples might be ensuring participatory and inclusive decision-making across the board when we're talking about all of these important changes, really deep, complex transformations that we're talking about. So ensuring that right to participate in decision-making and local self-determination and so on. So these are really important aspects when we're thinking through the social equity and key vulnerable audiences as well that are absolutely part of this change.
Wonderful. Scarlett, how do you feel about this one? To achieve widespread systems change, do our beliefs about the inherent rights of our natural resources and beings need to change?
Yeah, well, I definitely believe they do. I mean, as I said before, we have a limited amount of land, and we need to share that land with other people and with nature. And unless we do that, then there's, it's not really an option for us not to protect nature because we rely on it so much. I mean, the stat that's often mentioned is that, half of the world's market value is highly dependent on nature. I mean, that's an economic stat, which perhaps in some ways is a bit reductionist, Nature is absolutely everything to us. So I do think that needs to change. And I maybe also just to come in on what Rachel was just saying about the need to have these sort of participatory processes. I mean, when you start talking about rapid acceleration of systems and disrupting systems, it can sound very nerve-wracking, especially when you're talking about systems that deliver, are there to deliver food security. And so I think having a really kind of democratically agreed upon vision for what that system looks like is absolutely the first step. And I also think we have to be honest and recognize that, rapid systems change in the way that we need to deliver is going to have some people being left behind. For sure, it's going to be less people being left behind than if we do nothing. The current trends of the system today are very bleak. But recognizing who are going to be marginalized communities in this transition and making sure that there are social safety nets, opportunities for retraining, and that they are kind of included and that their voices are heard in this process is really critical.
Thank you so much. Rachel, I might come back to you for the last word here. Systems change. For those of us who aren't so immersed in it in the day-to-day, could you give us your final view in a sense of what the potential here is and what's at play here, and how hopeful you are that the world is waking up to acting with this approach and this vision going forward? Thanks.
Yeah, I think why use a systems lens, right? When it might just be a lot simpler to think, if A, then B. We've been doing that. It hasn't been getting us to where we need to be, and science is telling us it can no longer, it's no longer fit for purpose. So we absolutely need to change. And so dimensionalizing the way in which we view these massive challenges, and then recognizing there is no silver bullet. We absolutely need that jigsaw puzzle of solutions, and really, thinking through how shifting the component parts of a given system and the patterns and interconnections between all the aspects that we've talked about here today will ultimately form that new system that we've been discussing that behaves in a qualitatively different way, will really help us set us on that right path, right? So I mean, we're at the crossroads now. The decisions we make now will really take us down one of two roads. And so really hoping that a systems lens and the kind of interconnection of that jigsaw puzzle solutions will really take us down the path we need to ensure that we're meeting our climate, nature, and equity goals.
Thank you. Well, I for one have found this incredibly inspiring. I'm sure everyone who listens to this will too. Are there any parting words from Dario or Scarlett that we haven't covered? If not, we will close this podcast and look forward to receiving a wide audience.
Maybe just to reiterate, it's about how we use land and what we eat is like the key tool. It's one of the key tools through which we shift our system. And so, every time we make some food or go to a restaurant, like view that as us being kind of active participants in system change.
Yeah, and I would add to that that even if it looks or sounds small, we're all part of the system, no? And we all can make contributions with different aspects. It's voting, it's about mobilizing. If you have the power to or the willingness to mobilize, to act, to voice your raise your voice. Also, it's about the small actions like recycling, small actions like Scarlett, I think along your lines, the power of choice in consumption. What kind of food do we eat? Where do we shop? What kind of products do we buy? Also the energy choices that we make. Can we commute or not commute? Can we use our car? So those small things that it sounds like repetitive, and everybody talks about that, but it's unbelievable the power of individuals working together, because that's where we start breaking the silos. If we start acting in whatever way we can, but we all have a responsibility, and we also have a little bit of power to move.
Hello everybody, I'm Midori Paxton and I head Ecosystem and Biodiversity work at UNDP. Systems change is probably the most important theme of our work. For nearly half a century, UNDP has been supporting 140 countries to better safeguard their natural capital because nature is a fundamental human development asset for countries and people. Our study found that 50% of the 169 SDG targets need the power of nature to be realized. And we cannot achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement without leveraging nature's ability to store and absorb carbon. There is a huge amount of scientific evidence illustrating how nature underpins our society, our well-being, and our economy. But we don't even need the science. We can feel it through every breath of air, every drop of water, and every mouthful of food. The colors we see around us, the music we listen to, the medicines in our cabinet, and engineering innovations such as airplane wing and wind turbine designs are all rooted in nature. Our species has been inspired by nature ever since humans emerged 300,000 years ago. We are newcomers compared to the first life forms on Earth that emerged nearly 4 billion years ago, setting off the process that wove together the miraculous web of life on which we all depend. And yet, we are waging war on nature, on our best friends and allies, because somehow our societies and economies are wired for us to fight with nature. This needs to be untangled and straightened out. We need systems change. Most of us have had the experience of having a houseplant die, telling ourselves that we must water it tomorrow and then forgetting it until the threshold of repair and resuscitation has passed. With an average decline of wildlife species of almost 70% since 1970 and 1 million species possibly going extinct in the near future, our natural world is getting close to that same tipping point. Why is this the case? Despite the environmental movements that sprouted around the world since Silent Spring, and despite myriad local, national, and global nature conservation initiatives so many people devoted their time and their life to, I would say because of a false dichotomy that environmental and economic imperatives are in opposition. Because we have created a totally unsustainable production and consumption system that ignores the basic limits to growth. Because money is invested in actions that causes harm and destruction to nature, nature's values and services remain invisible in economic and financial cultures. And because there's no serious penalty in destroying nature for private gain, although it means theft of our heritage and lifeline. And instead, thousands of environmental defenders are being harassed or even murdered each year. The coming years up to 2030 are critical. We do not have the luxury of time. UNDP believes a set of 3 global shifts is necessary to see accelerated, substantive, and bold enough actions to stop the nature crisis. The first is a narrative shift. We need to dispel the notion of trade-offs. Arguments around trade-offs between development and the environment belong to the last century. Nature has empowered and will continue to empower people to tackle multiple development challenges. For instance, nature-based solutions for water supply could save $140 billion annually and provide clean and safe drinking water for 1.4 billion people by 2030. Coral reefs support at least 1 billion people through fish production, coastal protection, and income from tourism and fisheries. All of these benefits can continue to grow with good stewardship. We need new social norms to make nature destruction a serious taboo. We need to cause rapid behavioral change. We need to build a strong narrative to bridge conservation and nature impacting sectors and identify champions to influence constituents across governments, businesses, and civil society. We need to leverage legal and human rights instruments and facilitate civic actions to demand change. The second shift is economic and financial. We need to redirect flows of finance from nature negative to nature positive outcomes. Without nature, there is no economy, no business, no life. We need to start viewing nature as an asset to nurture, an asset to invest, and an asset to grow. Indeed, more than 50% of the global GDP is dependent on nature. The World Bank says protection of nature could avert global economic losses of $2.7 trillion per year by 2030. We know the cost effectiveness of nature-based solutions is very high, and the cost of inaction on nature protection is extremely high, both economically and socially. The third shift relates to policy and practice. The change in a perception and recognition of nature has to be translated into new policy. Fiscal, land use, agriculture, or fisheries, for example. Sector planning and practices must change to ensure production and consumption systems that are in harmony with nature. Nature-based human development is the only choice we have for our safety, well-being, and prosperity. With all our human ingenuity, now is the time for us to collectively reach the tipping point where we are all racing to take action. We cannot burn down our only home. We cannot sink our only ship. It doesn't make sense. We need systems change that will engender billions of actions and movements and shape the history book of our time, where rampant deforestation and habitat loss, toxic pollutions, and plastic oceans are a thing of the past and safely contained in our history books. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Damon Santola. I want to share with you a few ideas from my new book, Change, on how tipping points work and how social network strategies can help to trigger tipping points in society. So the way we typically start is by looking at a large-scale social network and all its interconnected patterns. And typically what we do is pick out key people. So there are some people who are highly connected, and they tend to be located in the center of the network. And then people who are less connected, who are located out in the periphery. Now, one of the key sort of theories of social change that's been around for a very long time has been that tipping points are typically triggered by highly connected people, often referred to as influencers. So when that person adopts, their disproportionate social connectedness allows them to trigger lots of people, which then gives rise to sort of a snowball effect that reaches the rest of society. What's so interesting is that that theory of social change has been around for 3/4 of a century, but there's never been good enough data to test it. So in the last couple of years, what we started to do was to test this theory, and what we found is something interesting. When we look at data on social change, for example, mobilization around Arab Spring, but also lots of other kinds of social change dynamics, we tend to see social change taking hold in the periphery of the network and then spreading not to the center, but actually around the structure of the periphery and only reaching the center at the end. So this represents a really important scientific puzzle in our theory of social change and tipping points, which is our best ideas from the last century tell us that things start in the center and spread outward. But all of the data from the last decade tells us that real social changes tend to spread from the periphery, which is where tipping points are triggered, and then only reach the center at the end. So what I want to suggest is that what goes wrong here is our theory of networks, that basically when we look at these two networks, we intuitively think the network on the left is going to be our sort of trigger point for initiating large-scale change. But actually, it's the network on the right, and this is what I'm going to talk to you about briefly today. The network on the right that's able to really effectively trigger a growth of a critical mass, which ultimately triggers society-wide tipping points. And so what goes wrong here in our intuitions, why we pick out the network on the left rather than the network on the right, is we're basing our ideas on epidemiology, that is to say, the science of viral spreading. And this is really what's referred to as simple contagions, the idea that all that's required for contagion to spread is contact. So if someone has COVID-19, they come into contact with a lot of people, they're responsible for an outbreak or an epidemic. But it's different when we think about social thinking, where people are changing their ideas and beliefs as a result of their social context. In this case, these dynamics are complex contagions, which means people really rely on the social reinforcement from the people around us, and networks interact in complex ways, making the clustered structures and the peripheral structures I showed you on the right actually much more effective for spreading complex contagions than the people who are highly connected in the center of the network. So let's talk about this myth of the influencer. So we have this idea of a connected network, the people in the middle and the people in the periphery. And what goes on here for a simple contagion is that someone who's highly connected in the middle of the network can easily find out about a new idea. And if that person adopts the idea, then they can spread to lots of people. And again, this is consistent with the viral model. So from the perspective of simple contagions, the network on the left has clear advantages of the network on the right. But here's the thing about complex contagions. Often when we're thinking about adopting a new behavior or an idea or an innovation that's contentious, it's not just that we need to be convinced to adopt it, it's that we need to be convinced that it's legitimate in our social circle. So think about someone who's highly connected. Now, their adoption behavior is highly public and highly commented on. So if they adopt an innovation, actually all of those ties aren't necessarily outgoing ties. They're really incoming ties. These are people who are judging them based on what they do. And this is one reason why people who are highly connected can actually be the last people to adopt an innovation rather than the earlier people. Whereas the network on the right, people have more modest contacts, and those contacts are clustered, which allows for social reinforcement, which can more easily grow a critical mass of support for an innovation. And as a result of this, the network on the right is a place where innovation can more easily take off. So now let's think about this in terms of how to target tipping points. So one of the classic ideas people think about today is if you want to grow a tipping point, find an influencer and convince them. The idea is that although they may be more reluctant to adopt, you can nevertheless incentivize them and therefore presumably trigger a cascade. So let's see how this would work for a viral video or a simple contagion. You get that first highly connected person to adopt. They then activate all the people they're connected to and the people they're connected to, and you get this sort of viral diffusion. This seems like it could work in lots of cases. And I think when we talk about complex contagions, a lot of people say, well, we've already got viral strategies in place. So what's the harm of just going ahead with our viral strategy? Here's the thing. The failure of viral strategies isn't just that they won't work when it comes to spreading complex contagions. It's that if there are social norms at stake and issues of legitimacy, then the viral approach can actually lead to a backfire. One of the best cases and examples of this is Google Glass, which was this exciting, memorable, very sticky product. And the strategy was to use elite influencers to sort of initiate a tipping point in people's desire to have the Google Glass technology. Of course, it was sort of a cyborg technology where you could, browse the web while you were talking to people and then surveil and record the visual environment. But that triggered a real backlash because the idea that you would browse the web while you're talking to someone violated norms about contact. And the idea that you could record the visual environment without people knowing violated norms about privacy. And so instead of the influencers becoming the people that everyone aspired to be like, instead there was a strong social reaction where the product and the influencers associated were rejected and referred to as glass holes. And this not only led to the shutdown of the product, but actually damaged Google's overall reputation. And so the question is, if you're in one of these situations where social norms are at stake, where these green nodes aren't just passive actors waiting to adopt, like be infected with COVID-19, but actually people with beliefs and norms that are sort of considering the different options available to them, then if you initiate an influencer, well, that person may convince one or two people, but those people they're trying to convince are also surrounded by countervailing influences from non-adopters, and the social norms sort of prevent this idea from taking hold. But if you take the same network with the same level of resistance and instead target the social cluster out here in the periphery, something amazing happens. Social reinforcement doesn't just try to spread everywhere at once. Instead, what happens is these clusters tend to generate support through wide bridges, which cascade through the periphery of the network. And this is where critical mass happens. You get a large enough group in the periphery that then it triggers a tipping point that then spreads to the center of the network and reaches everybody else. And so what this means for tipping points is that the logic of the growth of Black Lives Matter is very similar to the logic of the spread of support for same-sex marriage, which is similar to the logic of the spread of Twitter. Basically, in all these cases, you have these dynamics where there's slow initial growth at first, then there's sort of some critical elbow where growth accelerates, and then past that point, it reaches the vast majority of the population. And so historically, what we've done is describe these tipping points in terms of the adopters and say, well, first you have the early adopters, you need to reach them, then you get regular people, then you get the laggards. The point I want to impress upon you is that this characterization of this diffusion curve is a post hoc labeling of different parts of the curve, but there's zero social science to suggest that what's actually happening in one of these curves is that there are different types of people. What's really going on here, in fact, is these are different parts of the social network. What's going on during the early growth phase is that people who adopt early are actually people who are in the structured periphery. And the reason it's spreading slowly is because it's cascading through wide bridges. Then when it reaches a critical mass, that's when there is enough reinforcement to carry this idea through the center of the network and then ultimately reach the unstructured periphery. So in terms of the diagram I showed you before, What this means is when the innovation takes hold in the periphery, now it's spreading in a way that appears to be slow compared to the viral model. But what's really going on is it's building a critical mass of support so that now it can sort of convince lots of different people, even highly connected people, to adopt. And that's when acceleration happens in the growth curve. And so this is true for the spread of solar panels. These are all topics I discuss in the book. For spread of changes in race and gender bias in medicine, for changes in polarization online, for the growth of Me Too, and even for the acceptance of face masks and vaccination. And so what this means is when we look at these kinds of networks, although the network on the left is tempting to think of as a target for growing a critical mass that can trigger a tipping point, it's actually a network on the right where we're going to see the greatest effects. So all of this is described in much more detail in my recent book, and I look forward to taking your questions. Thanks very much.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. You are tuning into the Systems Change in Practice session at the Nature for Life Hub. My name is Josie Rain. I am the Strategic Communications Specialist for the Nature, Climate and Energy portfolio at UNDP. I'll be your moderator for our panel discussion coming up next. My own background includes public service campaigns, corporate marketing and behavior change for conservation. So I'm personally thrilled that our panelists today represent such a wide spectrum of sectors, knowing how valuable cross-application of expertise is for system change in practice. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. First, Katie Hefner, who is Senior Director of Partnerships and Engagement at the Rare Centre for Behaviour and the Environment. A warm welcome, Katie.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
We also have Tara Austin, partner in the Ogilvy Behavioural Science Practice. Thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, we have Melissa Miners, who is the Senior Global Manager of External Affairs at Unilever. Welcome, Melissa, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you for joining us today. Let's get started. We heard from Midori's opening speech that we need major transformational change, and that until the perceived opposition between environmental and economic interests is reconciled, society will not properly account for and value nature, and we will struggle to act at the pace and scale necessary. We heard how we need to identify and support the narratives that bridge nature and development, nature and economics, to enable systems change. We then heard from Professor Centola about how global narratives work and how they can create social change and shift systems today. This session will explore the potential for a narrative shift on how we value and account for nature from 3 different perspectives. Let's get started. First question. Katie, let's start with you. Rare is known for pioneering principles of social behaviour change for conservation. What have you learned over the past decade about using these principles? And what works and what doesn't in social change for conservation?
Sure. It's a great question and one we've thought a lot about. We've learned that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. We know that people are people anywhere in the world, and there are universal aspects of human nature and psychology that apply to everyone, but how those aspects manifest in their real life is entirely context dependent. So you can have an individual approach to meeting individual audiences in the most appropriate way, because we know, like, humans are humans, they're social animals, but what that looks like in terms of their social life, who their influencers are, what their norms are, may be wildly different on one side of the world versus the other. And so you really have to understand your audience before anything else. At our Center for Behavior and the Environment, we have a process called behavior-centered design, which marries those principles of behavioral science, those universal motivators of human behavior, with this process of design thinking. And it allows you to systematically and strategically understand how you can apply behavior change to different conservation settings. And so we've learned that behavior change is really about the methods and processes that get applied to context versus just a one-size-fits-all stamped approach. And then the final thing that I'll say is we've also developed this theory of cooperative behavior adoption. And we know that many conservation challenges out in this world are dilemmas around common pool resources. And so part of what we've spent a lot of time thinking about is how do we develop a guide that helps move your target audience groups through phases to ensure that cooperative action around common pool challenges. So things like fisheries, climate change, that's been really helpful when we consider how to motivate groups and when you design behavior change programs for conservation outcomes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Katie. Let's turn to Ogilvy and Tara. Tara, at Ogilvy, you focus on communications that change behavior. What have you learned about catalyzing nature-positive consumer behavior, and what works and what doesn't work from your perspective?
Well, I think the thing that we understand is that the biggest challenge with all nature-related communications typically relates to what we call psychological distance, and the fact that the challenges of climate change feel to people far off in terms of time and space. It's often things that happen on the other side of the planet in the distant future to other people. And so there is this distance between our behavior today and the consequences of that tomorrow. But we have been exploring different ways to close that distance. One of the most critical ways, and there are a number, but one of the most critical ways is actually what we call concreteness, which is just making things concrete, imaginable, and real, and bringing them as much into the here and now as possible. Just allowing people to really imagine and often visualize the difference that a behavior can make. You may be familiar, for example, with little images that have been painted onto the drains that you see in the city that have popped up, and around the drain it might say the sea starts here, trying to close that spatial distance, showing people actually if they drop a plastic bottle into the gutter, it doesn't just stay in the gutter, it ends up in the sea, out in Bali, or all of these beautiful places that we all want to stay pristine. It ends up on our beaches. Similarly, in a number of environments, they've done things like putting signage onto beaches that show this is where the water level will be in 2050. And again, we're just making visual, concrete, bringing into the here and now, making real that which is further off in time. So all of the ways in which we can do that, which we can visualize the impact of our behaviors, I think that's one part of what's going to be critical for shifting the framing and the narrative, and making all our immediate behaviors feel more important.
Thank you so much, Tara. Melissa, maybe I could turn to you next. And for you, what do you see as the 3 to 4 most important nature positive transformations that are relevant to Unilever's brands? And what role can multinational corporations play to shift us towards a nature positive systems change?
Thank you. So Unilever has a number of goals which contribute towards a nature positive society. We set out a new set of goals in 2020 to see us through the next decade. And in terms of nature positive, the first step is assessing our impacts. We're a large consumer goods business. We operate in 190 countries, and our material impact assessment showed that our largest impact on nature was through our agriculture footprint. So we source many soft oils, many different commodities, such fruit and vegetables from around the world, but our biggest impact is with palm oil in Indonesia and Malaysia. So the first piece is assessing our impact, which we've done for the last decade or so. And then measuring is the kind of what I identify as number 2 in terms of how we roll this out with farmers. So we have something called our Sustainable Agriculture Code, which we roll out to hundreds of thousands of farmers. And we now have evolved into our next stage of this, which is our regenerative agriculture principles. Again, implementing these with farmers and measuring our impact on nature and agri-supply chains, and not just the kind of impact on our sourcing programs, but what are the landscapes, what are the connecting landscapes around them? How do we take accountability for the ecosystems that touch our sourcing areas? And the third step, I guess, is disclosing this. So sharing as we learn. And we do this in many different ways through the Carbon Disclosure Programme, reporting on forests and water, and more recently with our landscape programme. So at the COP21 Paris Agreement in 2015, we committed to start taking a landscape approach to palm oil sourcing. So focusing on particular ecosystems and making sure that the agricultural expansion doesn't go into nature dense areas, protecting things such as wildlife corridors. We have a great partnership with WWF in Sabah, Malaysia, where we're actually increasing palm production on less land, restoring a riparian reserve and wildlife corridor next to the sourcing areas. But I think that the disclosure part there is the big change in the way the world is going, and particularly around the global biodiversity framework and the move to mandatory reporting. So I think we're going to see lots more of this to come from us and other businesses.
Excellent. Okay, a second question for everybody. I'd love to dig a little deeper and think about how we can transform change on a large scale. So Katie, RARE works in specific communities around specific goals. It would be great to hear from you about what you've learned about catalyzing social change at larger scales and what's on RARE's horizon for scaling social change.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's completely true that to reach the kinds of global conservation outcomes that we need, we absolutely need to be thinking about change at a larger scale. And that can be pretty challenging when you hear what I said earlier about how we need to tailor approaches to local contexts. But at RARE, we reconcile this challenge by thinking about scale as making it easy and less costly to replicate tailored approaches versus taking tailored approaches that worked in one place and just stamping them and replicating them other places in the world. So what I mean by that is, like, how can we support more local leaders and communities in taking behavioral science that we know works and the methods that we know work, and also the types of interventions that we know work, whether that be managed access to sustainable coastal fisheries or increasing plant-rich diets to reduce carbon emissions or land degradation, how do we help local leaders and communities to take those methods and behavioral science and then combine those with interventions effectively? And so part of what we think a lot about is how do we build capacity of the field to make that change that we need to see happen faster and stronger and better. So at RARE, we're doing this in a lot of different forms. For example, in one place we've launched, or in many places we've launched, the Coastal 500, which is the largest global network of mayors and local government leaders who are all working towards sustainable coastal seas and combining that with some thriving communities on the shorelines. And so they're sharing best practices and lessons learned worldwide on the methods that are making change happen. Within our Center for Behavior and the Environment, more specifically, we have resources on platforms such as behavior.rare.org. We're running trainings, we have advisory and design services, and we do a lot more just to focus on how do we build the capacity of these leaders around the world to drive the conservation outcomes that we need to see and reach that global scale that really needs to happen to keep this world running.
Thanks, Katie. Tara, from your experience, what would it take for an industry-wide shift towards nature-positive behavior? And what is needed to achieve major narrative shifts in how we value nature?
Well, I think what we really need here is both a left and a right brain response. And historically, people thought for a long time that the left brain was sort of rational and the right brain's emotional. It doesn't work like that at all, but they are different, the hemispheres of the brain. And Dr. Ian McEwen, who's world leader in this space, has shown, and the neuroscience now shows, that the left brain is very myopic. It only really understands exactly what is in front of it and every single task individually. And I think for our kind of left-brained world that we're in, what we need to do is break down big systemic challenges into tiny little pieces of a problem that we can put on a spreadsheet. A classic example of this is where we had the challenge of getting Recycle for London, trying to communicate with all of London about what it was that they should be recycling. Terrible problem. There are about 42 different levels of service in one capital city, from a terraced house to the house next door, different levels of service. You can recycle food, you can't. What do you put on the side of a bus that travels all over the city to tell one message to all of London? Nightmare brief. But what we showed was actually we needed to break down the problem completely differently. We used a lovely behavioral model, COM-B, in order to show them that actually everyone was recycling, or they weren't, but these young people that we were targeting were recycling at home and in the office and on the street, but they weren't recycling at home, and they didn't have a recycling bin. So it was very much the last mile first brief. Instead of talking to these people about what they should be recycling, we got them to get a recycling bin, and we doubled the number of bins in London from sort of 1.1 to 2 point something or another, by changing the brief and changing the challenge and creating an intermediate goal or proxy for the behavior that we wanted to see. So we need to break down the behaviors that we need differently in order to make them relatable, accessible, and ultimately break down that big brief. But that's the left brain piece. I think the really challenging bit is how we see this systemically, and that's what the right hemisphere of the brain does. It doesn't have words. It doesn't speak. If you disable the left hemisphere, you can't speak, you can't use words, but you do understand things and how they connect together, and you understand systems, you understand music, you understand the way things are connected, and that's what we really need from society. But it's a much more tricky brief. Other than everyone taking psychedelics, which is actually one distinct route that a lot of people are exploring to more eco-friendly behaviors because it encourages nature connectedness. Other than that, we do need to look at how we get groups to take pause, to take perspective. It's famously said that the first time that we saw the blue marble photograph of the whole Earth against the black of the night sky of space, that was a very important moment for mankind, because up until that point, only astronauts had ever looked back on our planet and seen that we are spaceship Earth. We're one planet. We are connected, whether we like it or not. And so things like that photograph, all manner of things, we need to come up with more processes, systems, opportunities for providing perspective for people, and really starting to understand how outside of our own little boxes, outside of our own little industries, we are connected, and perhaps in ways that we hadn't even anticipated. And I'll just leave you this, on that the president of Colombia was recently at the UN discussing the fact that his nation has been ravaged by the drug industry. And actually, whilst we might not, sitting in our industries, think too much about drug policy reform, actually ending the drug war, as far as he's concerned, is going to be one of the things that will allow the lungs of the world to have life again. So we might think of that as a very lateral industry that is banned, very much so, since 1971, but it's actually integrally connected to what it is we need to do, and is something that I think is going to become more and more important in the quest to heal our planet.
Thank you, Tara. And Melissa, how has Unilever approached some of the stickier systems level transformations like regenerative agriculture? And particularly, I'm interested in if you've actually deployed or used any narratives that have helped you find ways to mobilize change across your brands.
Yeah, I'm going to build on Tara's kind of big picture Earth piece, because I think it's a nice intro into how we might be able to mobilize change at scale, because as we know, nature is a local thing, but we're trying to deploy regenerative agriculture principles over many different geographies, which it often becomes a tailored approach. And we often say with regenerative agriculture, it's so new, and we worry that it's just businesses talking to each other about regenerative agriculture. And we have worked with One Planet Business for Biodiversity to have an aligned business vision, but is this kind of a common language with farmers? And at the moment, we're in the process of that kind of virtuous cycle of normalizing the regenerative agriculture conversation with farmers. And I should have said at the beginning that the farmers are the kind of the face of this, and they're essential to this, and they're the stewards of the land. So it's about continually learning from farmers, the people that know the land the best, and trying to incentivize good practice. A part of this at the moment in terms of big systems changes around the whole global repurposing subsidies to support the transition to regenerative agriculture, and therefore do any of these subsidies reach the farmer? I mean, this is some of the big picture levers that we're looking at the moment, and I refer back to the Global Biodiversity Framework and Target 18, which is on this topic. And then also taking the burden off farmers. So how can Unilever take the burden off farmers in terms of insurance, repurposing subsidies, incentivizing best practice? And I can give you an example of how we've tried to do this in Iowa with soy sourcing for our Hellmann's brand. We've partnered with Practical Farmers of Iowa with other companies as well in 2018 to create the Iowa Regenerative Agriculture Cover Crop Program. And this works to increase the adoption of cover crops and other practices such as reduced tillage, diverse rotation, and advanced nutrient management among farmers within the company's supply chains. And again, it's about learning from these farmers and hearing from these farmers and trying to create scale and using the power and leverage of Unilever to create scale.
Thank you so much. What was really interesting to me is that we heard from 3 different practitioners working on systems change at really different points in the system. However, there were some really common insights across that. One major one was that local and tailored understanding is so important in order for us to be effective. But that doesn't mean that scaling isn't possible. And making sure that we have perspective at that local and tailored level, and bringing that into our understanding and application when we're thinking about affecting systems change at a global level is key to that. So thank you so much for joining us today, and sincere thanks to all our panelists. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to Systems Change Lab. My name is Tappan Parker, and today I'm going to give you a brief demo of the Beta Systems Change Lab data platform, a free site which monitors, learns from, and mobilizes action towards the transformational shifts necessary to protect both people and the planet. You can visit systemschangelab.org to access the platform and learn more. Systems Change Lab has identified 70 transformational shifts across more than a dozen systems to highlight current action against climate, biodiversity, and equity targets. The data platform tracks indicators that measure how much progress has been made towards science-based targets, the current pace and scale of that change, and whether or not we are headed in the right direction. In addition to targets, the platform also analyzes key enablers and barriers of change to understand what underlying conditions can accelerate or impede progress. Within all of these targets and enablers, we also identify key indicators to watch. Those indicators showing promising signs of accelerated change and where we see momentum growing. Because this is a beta platform, we are only featuring 5 systems: power, transport, industry, technological carbon removal, and finance. We plan to release additional systems, including oceans, freshwater, food, forests and land, and cross-cutting systems like equity and governance in early to mid-2023. Today, I'll be showing you the analysis and data we currently have available, but you can look forward to more features next year and in years to follow, including a dashboard that will explore systemic connections between shifts. Systems Change Lab is a partnership project convened by World Resources Institute and Bezos Earth Fund. It supports the UN Climate Change High-Level Champions and works with key partners and funders, including Climate Action Tracker, Climate Works Foundation, Global Environment Facility, Just Climate, Mission Possible Partnership, Systemic, University of Exeter, and the University of Tokyo's Center for Global Commons, among others. Systems Change Lab is a component of the Global Commons Alliance. There are many ways to explore the data and analysis available on the platform. For a more narrative approach, we can dive in by system. Every system on Systems Change Lab has a systems page, which provides a high-level overview of the progress and action within each system. The top of a system features key stats and highlights action and change within the system, as well as the list of shifts within the system that we need to achieve, and a quick highlight of all the indicators we have assessed. Below the highlights, you can read an overview of the current state of the system, where we are seeing opportunities for progress and change, and what a transformed system might look like in the future. From there, you can learn more about each of the shifts needed to transform the system, and further down, start to see the trends we are seeing within each of the targets. Navigating to a shift page, either from the Explore button or from the left-hand menu, will bring you to a similar page, which provides a high-level overview of progress and action within the shift, including those key stats and highlights, a brief overview of the specific targets and enablers within that particular shift, and more. Below, we provide a deeper overview of the specific shift, what is currently happening, and what needs to happen to see a full transformation. We then introduce each of the indicators using small trend charts to show all of the indicators we are monitoring, both for targets and for enablers. You can scroll down further for all of these indicators, or click on a specific indicator to be taken to that indicators section. Each indicator has a set of narrative to explain why this indicator is important to this specific shift and what change we need to see occur over the coming decades. Each indicator chart gives a high-level overview of the global data, and hovering over the chart will allow you to see quick historic data points, current trends, and the needed pace to achieve our targets. You can see whether or not we think exponential change is likely to occur at the bottom of each chart, and the acceleration factor needed in order to reach our 2030 targets. You can download these chart views or share them. You can also see more about our data sources, including where data challenges might exist, and to go directly to the data source itself if you want to learn more. Each chart has a unique set of chart views, depending on how much data we have available. Some just include yearly change views that show year-over-year change in the data. Others provide country-level data to see how specific countries are trending in comparison to global values. We also provide a map view to compare countries around the world and see regional trends. You can also use the time slider button to see how these trends have changed over time. We also include disaggregated data where there is a relevant disaggregation, for instance, by renewable energy technologies. If you are less interested in the specific narrative and data behind indicators, and instead want to explore data across systems and shifts, you can use the dashboard view. At present, we have two dashboard views: a clickable pinwheel that provides high-level comparative overviews of where we are and aren't making progress across systems. Both views include a quick tour that helps explain how to use the dashboard. Our second view is a grid view, which allows you to search and filter through all the data we have available. You have the choice here of looking at target data or enablers and barriers, filtering down by a specific system or set of systems, as well as by status or category. You can also search for a key term, either to find a specific indicator or a set of indicators related to a certain topic. From here, you can always click on Explore Data to be brought to the indicator narrative on its specific shift page. Beyond the narrative, data, and dashboards we have available, the platform also includes key publications we've produced, like the State of Climate Action 2022 report, our methodology, which explains why we picked specific indicators, and a data download option, which lets you download all of our available data for your own use or filter down to specific data sets. If you're interested in downloading data for your own use, you can learn more about permissions and licensing on our licensing page, and of course, contact us if you have questions. As we publish new articles and host future events, you can find details about them on our Updates tab, or subscribe to our newsletter to get regular updates about our work and be updated immediately when we launch more data on our natural and cross-cutting systems. If you want to learn more about systems change, who we are, and what we're measuring, you can visit the About tab or reach out to us with comments or questions at contact@systemschangelab.org. We hope you can use the Systems Change Lab platform to spur action at the pace and scale needed to protect the planet and make transformative change.
What does nature mean to you?
Nature is our home, our food, our culture, our health.
It is our life support system, the fabric that sustains our life.
However, every day we're stretching the limit of life. We are at the brink of biodiversity and climate collapse. How do we get to this point?
Our current values and principles underpin this system, driving unlimited production, unlimited profit, and unlimited growth. This is incompatible with our only one limited planet.
We call for a real transformative change. We call the whole society to reform our values, principles, our behaviors, and actions for the sake of our shared future. Let's reinvent our system, share the benefits of this fabric of life equitably and sustainably.
Enough of short-term quick fixes and shallow solutions that deepen systemic societal and environmental struggles.
It is time to listen to the science, time to listen to the voices on the ground, time to be accountable.
Time for a strong, just, courageous, inclusive, and rights-based global environmental government, including the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the Road to Stockholm +50.
We need your leadership now.
We must uphold the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities and protect environmental defenders.
Actions on sustainability must be based on intergenerational equity, pursuing justice on all fronts for all generations.
We, young people representing different causes, constituencies, social backgrounds, ethnicities, genders, geographies, and languages, are coming together, calling for an unprecedented action for nature and with nature.
It is the responsibility of every individual to take action against that which threatens our home, not only for our generation, but for generations to come.
Rethinking development means that we need to reset our relationship with nature. But how, practically, do we do this? One approach is to use spatial data to find ways to reconcile goals for the well-being of people and the planet. In this segment, we'll hear about the UN Biodiversity Lab that puts spatial data on nature and climate into the hands of decision makers around the world. And then we'll hear from leading practitioners and data scientists on what it means to use spatial data to put nature at the very heart of sustainable development. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome. My name is Annie Vernig, and I'm a strategic advisor on science and policy for the UN Development Program. Today, we're excited to announce a new ELSA for All tool on our UN Biodiversity Lab platform. This proof of concept tool has the power to support countries as they work to implement a new deal for nature that will be finalized under the UN Biodiversity Convention next month. But let's take a step back. Why is this important? And what are essential life support areas? Let's explore these questions in our trailer.
We are facing a planetary emergency. Ensuring a healthy planet and reimagining development is essential for our very survival. To respond to biodiversity loss, climate change, and rising inequality, we must invest in nature, which underpins the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. Together, we must create a global safety net by protecting, managing, and restoring our Earth. But where and how? Spatial data or maps can provide us with the answer. Today, we generate more data in the blink of an eye than in most of human history combined. But how do we use this data to address our planet's crisis? UN Biodiversity Lab is a special data platform that gives decision makers the ability to measure the pulse of the Earth, enabling more informed policy decisions. Building off the data available through this platform, UNDP is providing communities and governments with special insights to map areas essential for supporting life. Using cutting edge science, we work with countries to prioritize and map their goals for biodiversity, for climate, and for sustainable development. The result, a map of hope that shows where to protect, sustainably manage, and restore nature to achieve goals for people and for the planet. By prioritizing where to take action on the ground, governments are reimagining development and putting nature at the center of decision making. We have 10 years to invest in nature. What we do now will determine the trajectory for the next decade and the next century. Now is the time to act. Join us as we support governments and communities in using spatial data to reimagine development and to put nature at the heart of sustainable development.
As you saw in the trailer, these maps of hope identify essential life support areas, or ELSAs, where nature-based actions can best contribute to national priorities. For example, in this ELSA map of Costa Rica, you can see ELSA regions where action could best deliver on national commitments. Blue for areas that should be protected, green for areas that should be restored to recover the ecological functions of degraded natural ecosystems, and orange for areas that should be prioritized for sustainable agricultural management. Starting from Costa Rica as our first pilot country, we worked with 12 other countries to map their essential life support areas. These countries helped us to customize the process, adapting it to unique national contexts, and to arrive at maps of hope that show where nature-based actions can best contribute to achieving national priorities for nature, climate, and sustainable development. These countries are paving the way to show how integrated spatial planning can identify powerful pathways for action. This type of spatial planning is essential to the proposed Target 1 of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework of the UN Biodiversity Convention. This work sparked a new question in our minds. What if we could create an ELSA map for any country in the world? Our goal was to put the pieces together to, first, develop the science to run an ELSA analysis for any country in the world, based on global policy priorities and using global data. Second, to develop the technology to make ELSA available on our UN Biodiversity Lab spatial data platform. And third, to apply this proof of concept to 3 initial countries. We recognize that this type of global analysis can never take the place of customized work and engagement at the national level. However, we believe that by developing ELSA at 3 different tiers, we can provide the most comprehensive support to countries to capitalize on nature-based solutions. Now, with the powerful UN Biodiversity Lab platform and support from our science and web development teams, we're excited to announce that we are on the way to achieve this dream. For those of you who aren't familiar, UNBL is a free open source platform that provides policymakers with access to the best spatial data and analytic tools to support them in their commitments to the UN Biodiversity Convention. And now, with support from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, we have added a proof of concept for functionalities on UN Biodiversity Lab that will enable countries to map their essential life support areas. Working with an expert advisory committee, we have successfully developed a proof of concept of this function for 3 pioneering countries: Costa Rica, Colombia, and South Africa. We use 23 global data layers to map 10 priority global policy targets on biodiversity, climate, and sustainable development that guide the rapid ELSA analysis. Users are able to change various parameters to create a map that reflects priorities in their country. They can also request that their data be used in place of default global data. We are seeking funding to expand this country to any country in the world in 2023. If you're interested to use this new tool, follow these 3 simple steps to access the ELSA tool on UN Biodiversity Lab for free. First, register to create an account. Second, request a UN Biodiversity Lab workspace. And third, notify us that you want to activate the ELSA function in your workspace. I'd like to offer huge thanks to our amazing partners and donors who enabled us to create this proof of concept tool, to our UN Biodiversity Lab partnership, and to all of you. We invite you to explore the ELSA for All tool on UN Biodiversity Lab today.
Costa Rica is a global environmental leader. The country is committed to conserving 60% of its territory, and it has an ambitious plan to decarbonize its economy. We understand that our economy is intrinsically linked to our environmental capital. For example, ecotourism represents about 6.3% of the country's GDP.
I am Jose Vicente Troya, resident representative, UNDP Costa Rica. Costa Rica's essential life support areas are critical for coping with climate change, designing sustainable landscapes, and greening our cities.
Costa Rica is located in one of the region's hotspots for future climate impacts. Costa Rica has already suffered substantial damages and losses to human lives, to agriculture, and infrastructure. This trend is likely to increase if we do not strengthen our climate resilience. We are experiencing unchecked urban sprawl. We need to create green spaces for recreation, for urban temperature control, and for ensuring ecosystem services for the city. We are also facing increased intensive monoculture crops, calling into question the balance between the environment and agricultural production. Understanding these challenges and embedding nature-based solutions into national planning will provide Costa Rica with a clear roadmap to address these challenges.
I am Carlos Cordero, Director of the Sectorial Planning Secretary of the Ministry of Environment and Energy in Costa Rica. Using integrated land using planning techniques, we are working to generate a sound national climate adaptation plan that considers nature as ally to tackle climate risks.
We are using spatial data to address different interconnected issues in Costa Rica. We have developed a map of hope using the ELSA methodology with the participation of national policymakers, local communities, and scientists. Now, the Ministry of Environment is making use of the results to produce the 2021 State of Environment report that will measure gaps, challenges, and advances over the past 4 years and set a baseline for upcoming actions on environment.
I am Rafael Monge, Director of the National Center of Geoenvironmental Information at the Ministry of Environment and Energy of Costa Rica. we are developing the latest State of the Environment report by harnessing the ELSA map results that we help producing using high quality, reliable spatial data.
In addition, the Directorate of Climate Change decided to use ELSA to develop inputs on ecosystem-based adaptation for Costa Rica's National Climate Adaptation Plan. Thanks to its flexibility, we are generating an ELSA processes specifically on climate adaptation. ELSA helps identify areas where ecosystems can help reduce the impact of climate events, such as storm surges, flooding, and landslides, and identifying where nature is vital to secure ecosystem services for the future generations. The ministry is also using the results of our ELSA mapping to support our agro-environment and urban environment agendas by helping to guide the spatial priorities. Using the spatial data that we collected for ELSA, we can identify possible conservation corridors between agricultural units, as well as critical freshwater reservoirs for urban populations. We began mapping essential life support areas in Costa Rica in 2019. After perfecting this process through several iterations and producing maps of hope for specific themes, we are now using the results to inform 4 policy processes. I am Franklin Paniagua, Vice Minister of Environment of Costa Rica. Join us in mapping nature to reduce climate risks, to promote sustainable productive landscapes, to green our urban areas, and keep our cities cool. Join us in mapping nature for life.
South Africa is an extremely biodiversity-rich country, sporting high levels of endemism, making South Africa a preferred destination for nature-based tourism. South Africa's biodiversity serves as an important foundation for economic growth and sustainable development. The protection and enhancement of environmental assets and natural resources are high on the South African agenda. In stark contrast, however, the triple challenge of poverty, unemployment, and inequality are still prominent socio-economic challenges that are faced by the majority of South Africans. The United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, together with its key partners, has been leading work to harness the positive opportunities provided by biodiversity and natural ecosystems as a catalyst for sustainable development and economic growth.
I am Ayodele Odushola, the resident representative of the United Nations Development Programme South Africa Country Office. The UNDP remains committed to supporting the government and people of South Africa to achieve their national and international development goals, as well as outlined in the National Development Plan and the Medium-Term Strategic Framework. In 2021, we plan to ramp up the global ambition for nature, climate, and energy with the high-level dialogues on energy, the Biodiversity Conference of Party, and the Climate Change Conference of Party 26.
The South African National Development Plan, Vision 2030, confirms that national economic growth is dependent on the environmental sustainability of our proposed development path. A growing economy needs secure water sources. South Africa's 22 strategic water source areas cover 10% of the country, but experience over 50% of the country's rainfall. These areas, together with the river systems that deliver water to the economic centers of the country, must be effectively managed and secured to continue and enhance water quantity and quality. Biodiversity must play a role in building South Africa's economy. Sustainable resource use through the wildlife and bioprospecting sectors are being explored through the delineation of and investment into biodiversity economic nodes.
Good day. I'm Deshni Pillai, the Chief Director of Biodiversity Information and Policy Advice at the South African National Biodiversity Institute. In partnership with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment and provincial conservation agencies, we have developed high-quality, reliable spatial data on nature for decision makers. These maps of critical biodiversity areas and ecological infrastructure are helping stakeholders to manage land, rivers, and catchments for sustainable development.
South Africa is one of the global leaders in using spatial mapping to inform land use decision-making across sectors. The ELSA project, which has just been initiated in South Africa, presents an opportunity for the country to use their spatial datasets in order to represent the country's top spatial priority targets. Mapping synergies and conflicts across the different policy priority targets will be important points of departure from which strategic decisions and trade-offs need to be made. Using the spatial data that we are collecting for ELSA, we can further visualize priority ecological infrastructure as well as areas important for ecosystem-based adaptation and for stimulating the biodiversity economy.
Awareness, understanding, and addressing our impacts and dependencies on nature are some of the challenges experienced across all sectors of the South African society. South Africa, however, is one of the mega diverse countries in the world. We love and enjoy nature, use it and trade it, but we don't really understand nature's real value, nor how it is central to development, or that investment in biodiversity should be considered as development and growth.
Armed with our map of hope, we can now collectively make better decisions about how to protect our ecological infrastructure and sustainably manage nature for a thriving biodiversity economy, which are the backbone of the region's economic development opportunities.
Colombia is considered the second most biodiverse country in the world, hosting 10% of the world's species. This biodiversity needs to be recognized and incorporated into development strategies. We already know the benefits of biodiversity for achieving our national sustainable development objectives, but we still need to make biodiversity a central axis of the country's development. We already have important achievements. The reduction of deforestation by 19% in 2019, the implementation of the National Circular Economy Strategy, the filing of the Escazú Agreement in 2020, and in the insurance of the Law 2111 on crimes against natural resources and the environment. However, the country still faces major challenges at a different scales. Deforestation continues in some areas of the country, posing enormous local and interinstitutional challenges. Similarly, the current pattern of natural ecosystem conversion has a legacy of human footprint and ecosystem degradation.
My name is José Manuel Ochoa Quintero. I am the head of the Biodiversity Assessment and Monitoring Program at the Natural Resource Research Institute Alexander von Humboldt. Essential life support areas are crucial for Colombia, as they define important zones for biodiversity, climate change, and economic development.
Environmental deterioration in Colombia generates an annual cost equivalent to 3.5% of the country's GDP, especially the loss of key ecosystem services, such as drinking water. This is not only paradoxical, but also worrying. Colombia depends on nature for its water. In fact, 70% of our water comes from the páramos, and a third of the population benefits directly from the regulation of water derived from high mountain ecosystems. However, the loss of drinking water and the growing threat posed by climate change could reduce water provision by up to 70% in coming years. The direct benefits of biodiversity in reducing poverty and inequality and contributing to food security are even more relevant after COVID-19. where the country's poverty level increased from 37 to 42%. The use of spatial data in conjunction with the strategic planning approaches represents an opportunity to assess where and how biodiversity can most effectively contribute to SDGs and human well-being. The national level analysis using the ELSA methodology have allowed us to identify priority areas for restoration, conservation, and sustainable use, which facilitates the management of important territories for biodiversity, for climate, and for sustainable development. This methodology can be applied at different scales, as demonstrated by our mapping of nature for water security in the central region in Colombia. This is also key because the challenge of guaranteeing the provision of drinking water, mainly in cities where 83% of the population will live by 2035, implies having a regional perspective that recognizes the flow of benefits from natural areas close to densely populated cities. ELSA facilitates the identification of biological corridors, key conservation areas, watersheds, and agricultural use areas, among others, that should be considered for water security planning, ensuring that ecosystem services and water provision is protected for current and future generations. Beyond the purely biological and ecological information, this integrated mapping approach allows us to incorporate socioeconomic information as well as connect public policy objectives with concrete actions in the territory. With such an ecologically and culturally heterogeneous country, the ELSA methodology allows us to regionalize the prioritization exercises, where several voices can be heard and consensus can be built based on the best spatial information available. Join us in identifying essential areas for life in Colombia. Nature for Life.
Nature is vital to the economy of Cambodia, a country that continues its transitions toward a higher level of development. Since 1990, we have succeeded in having extremely poverty. Our country's rich and diverse nature is a main contributor to this economic growth. Despite this progress, however, many families critically depend on natural resources for food, shelter, and income, exposing them to risks from climate change and biodiversity loss. I am Chupari, Director of the General Directorate of Environmental Knowledge and Information, Ministry of Environment. Cambodia has many essential life support areas upon which the country's economy depends. Identifying and preserving these key ecosystems also help to preserve livelihoods. And with our map of hope, we can now collectively make better decisions about how to protect and sustainably manage nature, the backbone of the region's economic development opportunities.
I am Oigamal, Deputy Director General of the General Directorate of Environmental Knowledge and Information, Ministry of Environment. Using integrated land use planning techniques, we are working to alleviate poverty by developing nature-based economy solutions that offer livelihood alternatives through unsustainable logging practice and fewer wood use in forest area. The Cambodian Ministry of Environment is working with local community, the World Bank, and UNDP to develop integrated land management policies that protect nature in tandem with building local entrepreneurial scale. The opportunities like ecotourism can boost economic prosperity while strengthening protected area management. Non-timber forest products provide another way to sustainably supplement local income, and carbon markets provide alternative financing opportunity while safeguarding nature.
My name is Ivan Lei. I'm the Director of the Department of Geospatial Information Services, Ministry of Environment, Cambodia. We are putting high quality, reliable data on nature in the hand of decision makers. Maps are helping stakeholders look across Cardamom Mountain, the landscape, together to more collaboratively decide on how, when, and where we have to act.
To harmonize forest and freshwater protection with development opportunity in the region. We are using spatial data to convince national policymakers, local communities, land managers, and scientists. They are helping us to develop a map of hubs using the ELSA methodology that puts nature at the heart of sustainable development for economic prosperity, climate resilience. Using spatial data that we are collecting for ELSA, we can visualize conservation corridor, proximity to villages, key biodiversity areas, community fisheries, and freshwater reservoirs. We can then identify areas that are more suitable for nature-based economic development and areas which can support local livelihoods now and in the future. This type of integrated land use planning is helping us build the type of economic safety net that many rural Cambodians need. They are securing nature-based livelihood. In this way, the ELSA project is providing us with data that is improving how we make decisions about land use, and also providing a baseline for our national environmental data management information system.
Join us to map nature for economic prosperity. Join us to map hope so that no one is left behind.
It is very important to consider enhancing nature-based solutions for ecosystem integrity, climate resilience, and human lives in Uganda, while focusing at the same time on mapping what we call the ecosystem life support areas, especially areas that are deemed to be supporting livelihoods amidst climate change in Uganda. Now, for this matter, we need to understand what exactly do we mean when we talk of nature-based solutions. These are national means and the actions that we use to promote nature protection. And there are basically three actions that we promote and enhance to ensure that we realize nature-based solutions. We do that through protection, we do that through restoration, we do that through sustainable management of ecosystems and their services. But then, this is done in the context of what we call ecosystem integrity, which refers to one, composition of the ecosystems in terms of species richness, biodiversity, connectivity, and other elements. But also it considers the structure. That is the relationship between the biotic and the abiotic elements of the ecosystems. And for example, the extension between wetlands and water resources in the country, there should be soil's health and the water resource system, and there should be soil's health and the ecosystem. These are all what we call the biotic and abiotic factors within the ecosystem. More so, and the fundamental, the best of it that we need to look at what we call the functionality of ecosystems. And these are the ecosystem services that promote and enhance human livelihoods through provisioning, supporting, regulating, and even cultural attributes for the various ecosystem services that we have. I will not dwell so much on the obvious functions and dividends or benefits of ecosystem services. I'll talk more of the importance of these services in terms of climate resilience and human livelihoods. In Uganda, it is very important to know that climate resilience in itself is not only about climate as a physical matter. It's about the extent to which ecosystems are able to absorb the shocks that climate risk have portrayed within the Uganda's geography. At the same time, it's about how the human society in Uganda absorb the shocks from climate risk, how they can get back to life after shocks, how we can remediate our life when we get shocks, and more so how we can reduce the disasters within the country. And in Uganda particularly, the issue of disaster risk reduction is very important in terms of nature-based solutions. And therefore, we need to protect the ecosystem. We need to restore the ecosystems. We need to sustainably manage the ecosystems to ensure that they promote what we call disaster risk reduction mechanisms. But also, particularly within the country in Uganda, we know that there are areas where we need to take into account the issue of disaster risk, especially the issue of the areas of the mountains, the hilly areas. We have got what we call the cattle corridor within Uganda. The cattle corridor is within the floodplains, basically the rangelands, which are prone to disasters, mainly drought and the floods. And therefore, mapping the ecosystems in terms of their livelihoods support systems and their ecological support systems and their climate resilience support systems is very important. And this mapping can only be done through special mapping mechanisms. Now, in terms of livelihood, we need to map areas of food security, water security, and household security. Now, what are the current gaps in Uganda? In Uganda, first of all, we have got inadequate scientific data and information that correlate ecosystem integrity to climate resilience and human livelihoods. As for effective ecosystem-based management system, we need data and information that are scientific. But also, we have limited institutional capacity. The institutions lack capacity in data generation, analysis, and use of the required scientific data information. So the spatial and socioeconomic data information are very important. They are really essential. But at the same time, our capacity is inadequate in terms of the skills, in terms of knowledge, in terms of the scientific the equipment that we need or technology. Now, what should be done for this matter? Now, we need to, first of all, we need to promote what we call ecosystem-based spatial mapping, ecosystem-based spatial planning and mapping, with the focus on climate resilience, especially disaster risk reduction, livelihoods, natural capital, with the emphasis on food security, water security, and household income security. We are aware that in Uganda, particularly, for example, the issue of soil health and biodiversity plan, we need to look at that. The issue of carbon storage and use in soils, forests, wetlands, and water. For example, peatlands in Uganda is not being considered so much. Peatlands are associated with wetlands, but they are very specific. They are very unique in terms of carbon storage and carbon use. So we need to look at that. We have got what we call the nature-based enterprises for income generation, with the focus on production, trade, and marketing. We have got value addition to ecosystems with the focus on ecotourism, trade, and social amenities. In Uganda, for example, we have got the new cities. These new cities could be looked at with a new paradigm, a new spectrum, a new horizon of ensuring that we promote ecotourism that are based on ecosystem services. Therefore, spatial planning in the urban areas could focus on water security, water supply, could focus on social security, the issue of social amenities like entertainments, the issue to do with the ecotourism, like for wetlands. Wetlands would be very useful in terms of value addition if we have facilities, if we have infrastructure that can promote ecotourism that are focused on ecosystem services, and that will add value to human lives in terms of trade, in terms of industry, and other life support systems. But also, we need to map the climate risk and disaster-prone areas with the focus on mountainous and hill areas, lake shores, riverbanks, floodplains, and regions. As I said earlier on, the cattle corridor of central Uganda and part of course northeastern Uganda, the mountains in eastern Uganda, the Elgon and the Rwenzori system, the Kigezi Highlands, and the Nile and Choga basins. These are all areas that are comprising what we call ecosystem life support areas. And therefore, we need to map them spatially. We need to get the empirical information and data on them so that planning is focused on the systems that are providing services, so that we invest more in conserving where we are inheriting services in terms of livelihoods and other services. But also, there's need for institutional capacity building. There's need to build the institutions in Uganda, capacity. There's need to build capacity in all institutions in Uganda. Most institutions in Uganda, except NEMA and possibly Ministry of Water and Environment and a few other ministries, do not know what it means and the purpose and the importance of what you call the ELSA approach. ELSA approach in ecosystem-based management is very important. But also the issue of designing and implementing ELSA-based flagship projects. We need to look at flagship projects that will promote ELSA-based approach, that will look at for example, the National Development Plan 3 and the incoming National Development Plan will focus on that area. If you look at the objective 4 in the National Development Plan, which is to focus on ecosystem services and the sustainability, it's the fact that we look at the indicators and the targets. These indicators and targets can only be mappable if we have got the scientific data. And therefore, the data are available, but are we able to use the data for that planning purpose? Are we able to sustain the planning purpose for that reason? At the same time, are we able to build this capacity across all the sectors to ensure that we have got the knowledge, we have got the skills, we have got the competence in ecosystem-based planning and in ELSA-based approach development in Uganda? So in a nutshell, I would say that enhancing nature-based solutions for ecosystem integrity, climate resilience, and human lives in Uganda will mean, one, having the scientific data information readily available and reliable. Two, building the capacity of the Ugandan institutions in understanding spatial planning and at the same time the use of the ELSA approach. And the three, coming up with what we call flagship projects that will focus on ecosystem-based approach and ELSA focus development planning in Uganda. Thank you very much.
Good morning, good afternoon, good day, depending on where you are. In the last 10 years, the monitoring of ACHI represented a step forward in terms of improving global analysis and biodiversity data. And the UN Biodiversity Lab was established to support countries in this path toward better monitoring, primarily by ensuring that countries have access to global data sources and global data providers. This served as a first step in improving transparency and improved use of data and reporting. However, as the focus of monitoring for ACHI was on global monitoring, biodiversity monitoring at the national level and the use of national data for reporting and review still has remained a challenge in many countries. In the context of the post-2020 framework, parties have recognized that better monitoring and use of biodiversity data to guide action is critical to the success of the framework. This includes not only for tracking global progress, but also for guiding national decision-making and national biodiversity planning. As such, a current draft monitoring framework includes a set of headline indicators, which are meant to serve as a minimum set of high-level indicators for capturing the overall scope of the goals and targets of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and which are suitable for tracking both national and global progress towards them. The monitoring framework also includes more detailed component and complementary indicators for tracking progress at specific levels or on specific biodiversity topics. Spatial data, which is nationally relevant and nationally owned, is essential for the implementation of the monitoring framework. Moving towards improved national monitoring of biodiversity will not happen overnight. In order to build national systems which are able to provide data relevant for monitoring biodiversity, requires continued collaboration and data sharing with global data providers, as well as collaboration at the national level across sectors, including with national statistical offices and national geospatial entities. The UN Biodiversity Lab has been re-envisioned as a tool for facilitating this collaboration. It allows data sharing at different levels and among different stakeholders and presents the information in a way that can be used by multiple users. After the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, if we're going to see real change towards improving the sustainability of the planet, and ensuring the future sustainable development for all of us, then we need better information and collaboration across stakeholders. We all need to work together, including all of you listening today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gillian, for setting the scene. Hello, everyone. My name is Corley Pretorius, and I'm Deputy Director of the UN Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre. Let's start basic. What is the UN Biodiversity Lab? The UN Biodiversity Lab is a free, open source platform that provides policymakers with access to the best spatial data and analytical tools. It does not require any GIS experience to use. We created UN Biodiversity Lab just over 4 years ago, specifically to support parties in their commitments to the CBD, with a focus on the 6th National Report to the Convention. With the initial launch of the platform, we challenged countries to double the number of their maps between the 5th National Report and the 6th National Report, and they succeeded. Following the completion of the 6th National Report, we fully re-envisioned the UN Biodiversity Lab based on feedback from users to provide a wide range of functionalities to support planning, implementation, and monitoring of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So let's dive in with a trailer introducing UNBL 2.0.
From the streets of New York City to the heart of the Amazon, maps help us understand how our changing planet is affecting our lives. Maps help us see where nature is thriving and where it is being destroyed. Spatial data help decision makers put nature at the heart of sustainable development by helping them identify essential ecosystems that help us secure water, feed more than 7 billion people, avoid natural disasters, keep carbon in the ground, and sustain more than 2 billion livelihoods. We, at the United Nations, together with our partners, are excited to launch the next iteration of the UN Biodiversity Lab. We have updated the UN Biodiversity Lab with new data and new functions to help decision makers put nature at the heart of development. To access more than 400 cutting-edge global data sets, including the world's first 10-meter resolution land cover and land use map. To explore popular data collections that unlock the power of data on key thematic issues and that provide insights on how and where action is needed most. To create a secure workspace where you can upload your own data to generate your own insights on the intersection of nature, climate, and sustainable development. To calculate dynamic indicators such as deforestation, showing the state of the planet at the click of a button. To generate your own powerful maps that can guide local and national action for nature, climate, and sustainable development. Powered by Microsoft's Planetary computer and supported by more than 30 data providers, the UN Biodiversity Lab provides novel insight that is essential for putting nature at the heart of sustainable development. Our goal is to enable everyone to harness the power of data, to equip policymakers with powerful tools to make more informed decisions on nature, and to be able to monitor the pulse of our planet. Join us. Start exploring today at unbiodiversitylab.org.
So how can we use UN Biodiversity Lab to support parties as they work to finalize, implement, and monitor the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework? First of all, UN Biodiversity Lab will be a key tool in the upcoming GEF-funded Early Action Support Project for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which will be implemented in partnership by UNDP and UNEP. This project will provide GEF-eligible parties with support around 4 components: the NBSAP alignment, monitoring, policy coherence, and biodiversity finance. The UN Biodiversity Lab partnership envisions a series of offerings to support planning, monitoring, and reporting. Target 1 of the draft Global Biodiversity Framework calls for bringing all land and sea areas under biodiversity inclusive spatial planning. UN Biodiversity Lab will support work on Target 1 through our data collections that enable policymakers to explore policy-relevant questions, as well as our proof of concept tool that supports countries to run a spatial prioritization analysis to identify priority areas for action. We also hope to offer tailored reports and guidance to countries for action on targets 1, 2, and 3, as well as other targets for which spatial data can support implementation. Our new data features will enable us to tag these data by relevant Global Biodiversity Framework target indicators for easy identification of the most relevant data for parties to work on this framework. Our team will also work to ensure that we have all spatial input data for the calculation of the headline indicators available on UN Biodiversity Lab. Our goal is to add metrics for all headline indicators that draw on spatial data, enabling push-button calculation for any country in the world. We know that supporting countries to create a monitoring framework that meets their needs is paramount. For countries that don't have existing monitoring systems or data platforms, we will create custom workspaces on UN Biodiversity Lab that can connect to national repositories to provide a one-stop location for national and global data relevant to monitoring needs. We also hope to update our metrics to work with any sources of national data. There are a wealth of organizations working to support national monitoring pipelines and systems. In addition to GeoBon, shown here, we will be connecting to other key tools and organizations, including DART, the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership, and UNEP Nature Commitments Platform, and more. Likewise, there are a wealth of organizations working to support spatial planning and prioritization. In addition to Maxon, shown here, we'll be connecting to other key tools and organizations, including the International Institute for Sustainability, IASA, the Spaces Coalition, and more to help countries to navigate and select the best option for them. We know that tools like UN Biodiversity Lab are more useful and impactful when technical support and training are provided as well. We'll be launching a series of training webinars in English, French, and Spanish to support parties and other non-commercial actors to explore how UN Biodiversity Lab can support their needs. We are also excited to be working to produce customized guidance documents and reports for GEF-eligible parties and to provide them with direct GIS support based on their unique needs. We invite you to join us to explore how spatial data can support you to turn commitments into action.
Thanks for joining this session on Rethinking the Nature of Development. Stay tuned as we start the next session on Working with Nature.